of before fertilizer and end of season leaching, before fertilization and end of season soils extractable ammonium and nitrate. And we're going to look at that information. We're going to look at the soil carbon and the soil nitrogen and see if those soil properties can help us predict the leaching. So I'm hoping that we can make some connections to the soils. Mike also asked if any of the farmers have nutrient management. Soil testing is not really used for a lot of the crops that we have. There is some stem and tissue testing though that was used, like for the peppermint. That's one that uses a fair bit of peppermint. You know, the oil has to have a certain nitrogen content, and so there was testing of some of the plant materials in the effort. But we didn't work with anybody who was doing soil testing for this project.
Well, thank you very much. We very much appreciate it. And moving on to our next talk. Our next talk is by Sherry Sullivan, Approaches to Helping CAFOs and AFOs Manage Manure Nutrients in Washington.
Hi, my name is Sherry Sullivan. I'm with the Washington Department of Agriculture's Dairy Nutrient Management Program. Today I'm going to focus on agronomy and more specifically soil nitrate N. And I'll provide an overview of what records Department of Agriculture's Dairy Nutrient Management Program requires from over 300 licensed dairies. We do not provide oversight, regulatory or otherwise, to non-dairy AFOs unless they have a CAFO permit. And we currently have about 27 active CAFO permitted facilities in Washington, only 16 of which are associated with dairies. Now, in addition to the dairy nutrient management plans, it is through record-keeping requirements, records review, technical assistance, and enforcement if necessary, that we're able to help AFOs and CAFOs manage their manure nutrients to meet the state's agronomy requirements. The records help us understand the dairy's nutrient management story. In 2009, the Dairy Nutrient Management Act was updated to include a record-keeping component to show that nutrients were applied at an agronomic rate. It wasn't until 2012 that the rule was written to clarify exactly what records were required to demonstrate agronomic rates of manure application. And in 2017, the state's CAFO permit was updated and adopted. Ecology administers the CAFO permit, and through a Memorandum of Understanding, WSDA conducts inspections and initiates investigations of permitted facilities. Agronomy and record-keeping requirements are pretty similar between permitted and non-permitted facilities, so I'll weave both WSDA's Dairy Nutrient Management Program and CAFO permit requirements into the presentation going forward. And when you hear me say CAFO, I am specifically referring to a permitted facility. All dairies and CAFOs must provide an analysis on all sources of nutrients. There's still a little confusion about what constitutes a source of nutrients and also when and where the sample should be collected, but generally our producers are pretty good about getting the majority of sources sampled and analyzed. You see the analysis requirements for licensed dairies on the slide, which are very similar to CAFO requirements. A major difference is that CAFOs must collect and analyze nutrient samples after TSUM 200 and prior to land application. While this can be problematic for producers who can't wait maybe another week after TSUM 200 for nutrient analysis results to come back, it is good to have clarity around sample timing. CAFOs also must collect and analyze samples two more times at evenly spaced intervals in a given year to account for seasonal variation of nutrient content. Annually, dairies must collect a representative post-harvest soil sample from the top 1 foot of fields receiving nutrients for nitrate N analysis. This requirement applies to dairies both east and west of the Cascades. Our biggest struggles with soil sampling is timing and consistency. For non-permitted facilities, there's no prescriptive timing other than post-harvest, which leaves too much room for soil tests to be collected too late to be representative of how crops used the nutrients that were applied during the growing season, especially on the west side where heavy fall rains can quickly drive excess nitrates below the 1st foot of soil. In addition to post-harvest soil sample, CAFOs must also collect a pre-land application soil sample to help them develop field nutrient budgets, which are required prior to any nutrient applications. On the slide, you can see the Dairy Nutrient Management Program's target for soil nitrate N, which is no more than 30 parts per million, and the threshold of 45 parts per million. When the target and thresholds are exceeded, we provide technical assistance using additional records for guidance or referrals for the producer to work with their technical service provider to bring soil test numbers back down. We also have a compliance path associated with exceeding the threshold in 3 out of 5 years. CAFOs have a prescriptive adaptive management plan that they must follow when nitrate N numbers fall within specific ranges. The ranges identified in the permit determine a field risk associated with soil nitrate leaching, which I've illustrated in a later slide. The inspection reports that the producer receives are designed to help illustrate their story of nutrient management. This is a snap of soil nitrate grids that the CAFO permitted producer receives in their inspection report, emphasizing which fields require adaptive management to bring soil nitrate N levels down. Non-permitted dairies receive a similar grid which tracks 5 years of soil nitrate N levels. It's just not quite as colorful as this one, but still pretty effective at telling the story of soil nitrate management. So let's talk a little bit about adaptive management. I don't know how common this is in other CAFO programs in the US, but in Washington, a field risk level of soil nitrate and leaching is established based on fall soil test results. In general, west of the Cascades, where rainfall is heavier, soil samples are collected at a 1-foot depth. And east of the Cascades, soil samples are collected and analyzed at a 2-foot depth. If soil test levels are high or very high, according to the table on the right, in 3 consecutive years, then prescriptive adaptive management is required by the permit. At the extreme, nutrient applications are prohibited. And while groundwater monitoring is not required, it is an option available to the permittee to demonstrate that they're not impacting groundwater. The other option is to produce fall soil nitrate N results that fall below 30 parts per million, i.e. meet the medium risk level. Sorry about that. Every 3 years, facilities are required to conduct a more robust soil analysis. CAFOs are required to only test soil organic matter and phosphorus every 3 years, in addition to the annual nitrate testing. They do not have the pH, potassium, and electrical conductivity requirements. But as you can see in the soil test results example, many of our producers obtain a more complete soil analysis every year, which can help both the producers and the inspectors identify other issues that may be affecting nitrogen management. Application records. There is a lot here, but all are needed to help tell the story of nutrient management. When we see an elevated soil test, we go right back to the application records and the nutrient analysis to help the producer figure out what's going on. CAFOs have all of these application record keeping requirements and a couple more. Every CAFO must develop yearly field-specific nutrient budgets based on field-specific soil tests, expected crop yield, soil nitrogen and crop residue mineralization, etc. The standard considerations for developing a nutrient budget. And that field-specific nutrient budget, based on soil tests, nutrient tests, etc., must be developed prior to the first nutrient application, which cannot occur until after T-Sum 200. All applications must stop prior to October 1 with caveats. Applications can occur after October 1 for permitted facilities if the CAFO demonstrates with soil samples and new field nutrient budgets that applications are necessary to provide nutrients to the double or cover or perennial crop. Manure transfers also play a role in a farm's overall nutrient balance. In fact, we have at least one dairy that's milking over 500 cows and has 0 application acres. Their entire nutrient balance is based on exporting nutrients to a third party, which is a whole nother can of worms in Washington. Looking at the slide at the top right, you can see a compost turner working dairy manure. Several of our larger dairies in central Washington export the majority of their manure solids as compost. Below on the left, you can see manure solids stacked and ready to be applied on berries. And on the lower right is a picture of a wee tractor and a wee manure tanker that has been developed specifically to apply liquid manure between rows of raspberries. We also require irrigation records, but this one is a bit of a challenge. Based on what we require, we don't have enough information to determine whether irrigation has caused soil nutrients to move below the root zone, potentially leaching to groundwater. Similarly, the CAFO permit requires producers to track the total amount of irrigation water applied to each field annually, but it does have the additional requirement also to prevent downward movement of nitrates and to not exceed holding capacity in the first 2 feet. So how do we use all of these records to help AFOs and CAFOs manage manure nutrients? Most of us start with the soil tests. If they look bad, we dig deeper. For example, if soil tests are elevated in 3 out of 5 years, but the application records show that they've only applied 6,000 gallons per acre of manure to a pasture that yielded 5 tons per acre of silage, something is wrong. We also work with the producer. We ask questions. We look at the nutrient management plan that was developed for that facility or the manure pollution prevention plan that was developed for the CAFO facility. Does it make sense that a dairy that produces 10 million gallons of manure a year has an empty 3 million gallon lagoon, no export records, and application records for only 2 million gallons of manure? We look for other records, such as crop rotation from grass to corn, that could explain elevated soil nitrates. Or maybe part of the story is that the new field person making applications hasn't quite got the hang of record keeping yet. Also, we ask about soil samples. How are they collected? Did someone just scoop the tops off the molehills in the field and submit those as samples? We also discovered, by doing a side-by-side comparison, that soil test results when using a shovel are much different than the results from using a soil probe when taken in the same location. So consistency is incredibly important. Yes, both the Dairy Nutrient Management Program and the CAFO programs require a suite of records to help tell the story of agronomy, but I think we can do better. We can provide better manure nutrient management help to AFOs and CAFOs if we add/change a few of our policies or requirements. Now, this list is not exhaustive, but let's start with soil tests. We really need to look at soil, nitrate, and thresholds through the lens of soil type and cropping system rather than one size fits all for both sides of the Cascades. It would be helpful to develop soil sampling protocols that were applied statewide and make the tools available to all producers to get more consistent sample results. We should also consider adopting the CAFO practice of requiring the second foot of soil analysis for non-permitted facilities. This really makes sense where precipitation is low and soil nitrate levels are high, especially when accompanied by irrigation. And speaking of irrigation, the records don't do much as we currently require them to inform us about how soil nitrate might be moving below the root zone. We should consider either dropping the requirement to keep irrigation records and maybe adding the requirement to have an irrigation management plan. The application records we see are wildly inconsistent in content and appearance. Some records are missing critical information such as where or when nutrients were applied. That's not good. And some are presented to inspectors on a scale between fly-specked, manure-covered envelopes to tidy computer-generated spreadsheets. Now, both forms may have the exact same level of accuracy, but one is certainly much easier to read. Nutrient analysis records are also inconsistent. If samples are not collected in a manner that is representative of what's being applied, they are of no use to the producer when developing a field nutrient budget and are of no use to us when we're trying to provide technical assistance. Broadly, we would love to have one record-keeping format that all producers, permitted or not, use. Washington State University Extension has helped make inroads on this by creating a nutrient management and record-keeping calendar. Every producer gets a calendar, and some producers are using the record-keeping portion. We know we have a long road to hoe to get producers to change to one record-keeping format, but we really are working on it. We've always emphasized that records tell a story, be it good or bad. And when we're provided with complete and accurate records, we do a better job of helping AFOs and CAFOs manage their manure nutrients. Thank you very much for your time and attention today. Hi, my name is
Thanks. Thanks, Sherry. Anybody have any questions? Please put them in the chat box. There's one already.
Let me see. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. So how was soil extractable nitrate target developed? We have looked to the land grant universities, WSU and OSU, providing their manure management and nutrient targets in their recommendations for west of the Cascades, which recommend no more than 30 parts per million for corn ground, and it's up to 15 parts per million for grass. One of the ways that we've tried to implement a fair and equitable guidelines across the state is to expand that to both east and west of the Cascades. Unfortunately, this has resulted in some maybe inequities for the east side of the mountains, which get very little rain, and it's not necessarily applicable to the guidance that was provided by OSU and WSU. So land grant university guidance is how we develop that. Another question, why do you think there's a difference in the shovel method versus the soil probe? Good question. So we stood in a field and we personally used our soil probe and we personally used our shovels, and we were standing right there pulling samples and trying to make sure that we had them mixed appropriately. They were shipped to the same lab. We followed our protocols for submitting samples. The only thing that I can think of is that with the shovel, there's a broader face on the shovel that pushes more organic matter possibly down into the sample. That's the only thing that we could think of. And the shovel method showed elevated soil nitrates where the soil probe did not, in the exact same location, well, within inches from each other. So they are different. Any thoughts on providing some funding, at least for the first few years, for soil testing and soil probes, et cetera? Yes, we would love to provide funding for soil testing and soil probes. I know some conservation districts have done that in the past, and we are now equipped in each one of our regional offices in Washington, so Yakima, Whatcom County, and Olympia for the eastern, northwest, and southwest regions. We have soil probes and we are happy to loan those out. So, and we can provide some technical assistance. If the conservation districts that the dairy producer works with is not available, we'd be happy to come out and provide some technical assistance.
We have time for another question. Anybody has one? Okay, well, thank you very much, Sherry.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we will go ahead and move on to the next talk by Wim Matthews. And this is also around CAFOs, AFOs, manure management with a focus on Oregon.
Oh, hello, everybody. My name is Wim Matthews with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. I manage the confined animal feeding operation and fertilizer programs at the department. And I'm here to present the middle section of the approaches to helping CAFOs and AFOs manage manure nutrients in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho.
Does this look okay to everybody? Sorry, this is a slightly different format. Somebody can just chime in. Are you seeing the full slide?
We're
Looks like
not seeing the full slide.
Okay, I'm gonna try that again.
Mode, Doug.
Okay, hold on.
Oh, hello, everybody. My name is Wim Matthews with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. I manage the confined animal feeding operation and fertilizer programs at the department. And I'm here to present the middle section of the approaches to helping CAFOs and AFOs manage manure nutrients in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So I wanted to start my section of the presentation with a little description about CAFO permit requirements in our state of Oregon. We define CAFOs that require permit registration at a statute 468 B215, and that is creates a universe of CAFOs for us that includes all of the federally defined concentrated animal feeding operations, as well as a pretty large group of state defined, what we call confined animal feeding operations. And so to give you a little description of the audience that my talk's going to address is going to be those permitted CAFOs that we define in our state statute. The size of that group right now is 512 different permit registrations across the state. 369 of those are federally defined facilities on a NPDES CAFO permit, and they're in general permit registrations. 4 are NPDES individual CAFO permits. And those are the group of 369 plus 4. That's the total federally defined facilities. 138 are on a state permit, water pollution control facilities, general permit, and 1 on a water pollution control facilities individual permit. And those 139 facilities are what we call the state defined facilities. So that's the description of the universe of folks that we deliver these services to. And we also have 12 CAFO permit registrations in some sort of pending status with us right now. So those numbers should be going up a bit here shortly. So part of the goals of our program is to encourage and maintain the diversity in Oregon's permitted CAFO universe. And as an example, using dairy permits as an example, the smallest facility that we have permitted in Oregon they're milking 3 cows, and the largest milks 28,000 cows. So you can see there's quite a large diversity in size. All of those facilities are on the same permit with the same discharge limitations. And definitely how they achieve those permit requirements and don't discharge the surface and groundwater are very different, are extremely different between those 2 facilities at each end of the spectrum. But that gives you an idea of the universe in a dairy example that we encourage. And so whether your waste system's is a pitchfork and a wheelbarrow, or the most highest tech, multi-million-dollar system, our expectation under the permit is they're not discharging to surface and groundwater. We also want to talk about something that we're promoting, which is that CAFO is not a bad word. Confined or concentrated. I like confined a little bit better. And as an example, there's been a big increase in backyard chicken activities, and that's probably United States wide, if maybe not wider than that. Definitely because of the pandemic, a lot of folks are gardening and raising animals at home. And those animals, while they don't require a permit in our state, we don't permit 4 or 5 chickens in the backyard. We describe that facility as a CAFO. It is a confined animal feeding operation. It's just one that doesn't need a permit from us. So we want to start talking about the fact that these aren't necessarily bad things, and if they're well managed, they do a good job for the environment and all the other metrics. So all these folks that need permits here in Oregon, all types and sizes of those permits that I talked about earlier require agronomic application of crop nutrients from all sources. And every one of those permittees must develop a nutrient management plan, or in our old nomenclature was animal waste management plan, where we're now moving to just nutrient management plan. They have to prepare one of those, and they have to follow it. It's incorporated into their permit by reference. None of the plans are the same. So of those 512 facilities, they all have a unique nutrient management plan. And that that provides the management component. And I want to start using these two different buckets, if you will, a management component and a structural component about how we address compliance and assistance on these facilities. Also, all sizes and types of permits require a system, if you will, manure nutrient collection, storage, treatment, and utilization systems that have to be described. Many of them have to be engineered, and they all have to be operated and managed to deliver designed water quality protection. And so we need to have the management activity, and we need to have the structures and systems that are to be managed to deliver these water quality protections. So how do we provide oversight to our permittees and assist them with permit compliance? Well, one of the first things we do is that we inspect them fairly frequently. Our goal is to have at least one routine inspection every 10 months. So we have regular contacts with permittees to assist them with compliance. And so one of the things that inspectors do in that inspection is to review the nutrient management plan and the required records with the permittee. And so we look at, their record keeping systems and more importantly, the data that they've put in those systems. We look at decision-making systems and importantly, the data that they've put into those decision-making systems and what decisions those systems have spit out. And then is the manure nutrient management system that's iterated in these data system, is that talking to the rest of the operation? And these are all management components, data collected from the operation of all these structures and systems that are generating waste, storing waste, treating waste, and applying it, these manure nutrients, and out to the crop system. And then at these inspections, we're going to also look at manure and process wastewater storage, treatment, and application systems. And our question there, as we look at these, is are these systems delivering designed water quality protections? And those are the structural components. These structural components are now starting to include things like decision-making systems. Sometimes they're saying, well, geez, I had a software failure and it caused me to get some strange numbers. And it took me a little while to realize that I had to make some changes there. So also in the CAFO inspections and oversight, periodically we'll perform targeted inspections that focus on one part of the system so we can pay more attention to that part. And these inspections are in addition to the 10-month routine inspection. And again, it's another part of our regular contact to assist with compliance with our permittees. These may be on larger facilities. These may be on facilities that are having challenges with compliance, permit compliance. These may be on facilities that are located in sensitive environmental areas like groundwater management areas. So they could be at the request of the permittee that we come out. And inspectors on one of these type of inspections may review and focus on things like fall soil nitrate samples, the results of those, soil P and K levels, soil moisture levels, crop yields and quality. And the questions that we're asking and things we're looking for is, are these sample results and this data that they collected, is that talking back to the nutrient management plan? And then is it matching the requirements of the nutrient management plan? And if it's not, is there an adaptive management activity taking place so that we can massage some of these activities to try to make them more matching up, make them match up a little bit better? And this is the management component of that plan and that facility. And then we also may look at things like, the manure and process wastewater storage systems. And we're looking at them for a little bit different thing this time. And it mainly are these systems delivering design capacity and ready for non-application season? So it's hard to follow your nutrient management plan if your nutrient storage structure doesn't have the capacity, wasn't emptied out completely enough the previous year and doesn't have capacity to hold nutrients for the non-application season. So again, we're looking back to those structural components to make sure that they're matching, because they're such an integral part of the system, they're matching everything else. All right, and so another thing that we would look at is the nutrient balance and status at field level, nutrient application timing, and are application systems calibrated? And if nutrient export is part of their plan, is nutrient export occurring? And so the questions are, is the nutrient management plan as approved by our department, is it operating as it was designed? Do there need to be changes to that plan? Because we believe the nutrient management plan needs to be a living document. It needs to be flexible enough to change as the facility changes. And those things we look at as management components. And then we also would be looking at manure and process wastewater nutrient separation and treatment systems. And the question there is, are these systems delivering the designed nutrient removal capacity, and are the reclaimed nutrients in a form for export? So several of our permittees employ these systems because they don't have enough land and crop capacity to utilize the nutrients they generate, and they need to move those off the farm in a form that's easily exportable and can be utilized by other entities. So some of the inspections unfortunately result in enforcement, and we use a progressive approach that includes several levels. So from lowest to highest, a water quality advisory, a notice of noncompliance, a civil penalty, and ultimately permit revocation if noncompliance is severe and serious enough, or severe and frequent. We would revoke their permit and not allow them to operate. And this provides regular contact, with permittees. We hope not as regular as the inspections for this activity, but we do several of these a year. The enforcement documentation provides required corrective actions, and some of those examples may be, we may be telling an individual permittee they have to limit total nitrogen application to no more than a certain number of pounds per acre per yield on a certain field or management unit. We may limit manure applications to none if phosphorus is a problem, and also limit any phosphorus from any other source to a certain field or management unit until the P index has a certain result or another milestone's met. We may require installation of moisture sensor arrays and limit hydraulic loading if it appears that there's over irrigation or too much liquid being applied that's forcing nutrients, below the root zone of the profile. And we may require sampling so many surface water locations for E. coli bacteria within a certain time of application to a field if we've seen repeated runoff discharges from that field in the past. And we would describe those all as management components. The enforcement, can require construction of manure and process wastewater systems, so we can do that under our permit. And we can also require proper operation and maintenance of those systems. If you have a system but you're not operating it correctly, it's not delivering that design water quality protections. And then ensure that systems are delivering their design storage capacity and that they're not discharging or imminently about to fail. And those are all structural components. This is an example of a notice of violation that we issued. It's pretty hard to read, so it's just for you to look at a later date. One example of how we would address some specific thing on a specific facility. So we also collaborate with our partners to help keep our staff up to date with the most current technology and science in nutrient management and in into these structures. So we're all, we're looking at both of the management and structural components. We have an advisory committee that meets 3 times a year that helps advise us on how to operate the program and brings some of these new technologies to the table. We have industry associations, state and federal partners, the research universities and other academia, both technology and equipment suppliers, and then cross-media impact specialists. As these farms are a holistic operating activity, and to look at water quality, in a bubble without looking at the other impacts that a facility like this, may have, is probably not holistic enough. So we're trying to involve some of those thinkings. Some examples of our collaboration with partners are to expand nutrient application acres, by exporting to other cropping systems. And so sometimes the easiest way to move nutrients is just to physically pick them up and move them, sometimes in just normal liquid systems without a lot of treatment or separation. And by making those connections between other cropping systems and farming systems, and our permitted CAFOs have been quite valuable in allowing the non-CAFO cropping systems to pick up on some of the manure magic, we call it, and there's been some great stories there. Also employ technology to provide data to assist management decisions. So sensors providing real-time data are been super helpful. Artificial intelligence and spatial data collection, and these are ever expanding fields that we want to pay attention to. And then to leverage sustainability issues like climate and other things that are coming down the road that may be helpful to our permittees in managing some of the nutrients that they need to manage. All right, one more slide here. And that is my contact information at the department. And I think there'll be a time for questions here at the end. All right, thank you so much for your time, and look forward to responding to questions.
Thank you, Wim. We already have one question in the chat box, and we have time for a couple more if people want to put them in the chat box.
All right, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Might be able to see me too. All right, there we go. So the question is, are there support programs to help producers cover export costs when enforcement dictates that they cannot apply manure to specific fields? And I would say generally no in our state, or at least not that I am aware of anyway in our state. I have heard of programs like that in other parts of the country, mainly the Chesapeake Bay area on the East Coast. And that's an interesting, definitely an interesting proposal or potential. I think the way that currently our CAFOs that need to export nutrients have worked with the receivers is there's been a shared cost in moving those nutrients from the generating CAFO to the receiving fields. Yeah, so I see a comment that it sounds like NRCS is starting to help with export costs. I agree that would be a valuable activity, and we'll definitely need to look into that. We have a new crew of NRCS folks in our state right now. And then another question is, how often have you had to restrict all manure applications based on P levels? And the answer is not very often. We've done it on a field or management unit specific basis. And for dairies, probably most folks will recognize the old field closest to the barn concept, where soil testing and records have shown that the soil P levels and the phosphorus indices levels are too high to allow any additional applications. And so we have done that on that basis. I can't tell you what percentage of total fields in all of our permits that would be, but I can tell you that it's a very low percentage.
Okay, well, thank you, Wim. That was great.
You're very welcome. Take care.
the time and ready to move on to the next one. And this will be another talk about approaches to helping CAFOs and AFOs manage manure nutrients. And this one with a focus on Idaho by Nick Peak.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Peak. I'm the Region 10 Agriculture Advisor, and I'm based out of Boise, Idaho. This morning, I'm going to talk about EPA's approach to helping CAFOs and AFOs manage manure nutrients in Idaho. However, let me step back a second, because EPA isn't generally known for our technical assistance capabilities, rather our regulatory abilities, and that's what I'm going to talk about more today. However, I'm going to touch on two things that we're doing to hopefully help producers comply with our new NPDES permit for Idaho. Now, as I mentioned, EPA deals with the regulation of nutrients and manure through NPDES permits, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits. A CAFO is a point source under the Clean Water Act. Therefore, a CAFO must not discharge unless that discharge is authorized by an NPDES permit. In order for a CAFO to obtain authorization under an NPDES permit, the CAFO owner or operator must either apply for an individual permit or submit a notice of intent for coverage under a general permit. On the next slide, I'm going to discuss the new Idaho NPDES general permit for CAFOs. That notice of intent includes a bunch of information, but I think the most important thing to mention here is that a nutrient management plan that satisfies the requirements specified in the permit and Section 122.42E of the NPDES regulations must be submitted with the copy of the NOIs sent to EPA. In Idaho, EPA recently published a new NPDES CAFO general permit. The previous NPDES general permit for CAFOs in Idaho expired on May 8th of 2017. Because of some feedback we got from the public and industry associations, we took our time to revise the new permit. The issuance of the new NPDES general permit was May 13th of 2020. That permit became effective a month later on June 15th of 2020, and all NPDES permits have a 5-year lifespan. Therefore, this permit will expire on June 14th of 2025. The general permit was supposed to transfer to the state of Idaho, or IDEQ, in July of 2020 as part of the phased implementation of Idaho's administration of the NPDES program. However, on the last slide, I'll talk about why that transfer hasn't taken place yet. Regardless of the transfer, EPA will remain the permitting authority for CAFOs located on tribal lands in Idaho. So that would be any individual permit or general permit on tribal lands, EPA would still write and administer those permits. I just want to highlight the major sections or components of the new Idaho NPDES CAFO general permit. The first section is permit area and coverage. This section deals with where the permit is applicable and who is eligible, how to apply for coverage under the permit, what to do when the permit expires, what to do when there's a change of ownership at a permitted CAFO, how to terminate permit coverage, and what are the requirements for applying for an individual permit. Section 2 deals with the effluent limitations and standards. We split this up into effluent limitations and standards applicable for the production area, as well as effluent limitations and standards applicable to the land application area. I think Section 3 is probably the most important section. This deals with the specific requirements for nutrient management plans, lagoon liner requirements, facility closure requirements, and the requirements for the transfer of manure to third parties. Section 4 deals with records, reporting, monitoring, and notification. So this is all records management associated with the permit. This includes the annual reporting requirements, the notification of unauthorized discharges, the monitoring or sampling requirements for all discharges, whether unauthorized or unauthorized, and what to do if there's any spills or releases of toxic or hazardous substances. Section 5 is in every single NPDES permit that EPA writes, and that's our standard permit conditions. These are general monitoring, recording, and reporting requirements, compliance responsibilities, and general provisions. Now, some of the requirements in Section 5 may not look like they fit with a CAFO, but they are in every single NPDES permit, and they're included in this permit as well. Section 6 is definitions. There's a lot of acronyms and terms in this permit, so we've attempted to define anything that might be unclear. There's also 9 different appendices associated with this permit. That includes the Notice of Intent form, NRCS Conservation Practice Standards, Tech Notes, University of Idaho Bulletins, the Annual Report Template, which I'll touch on later, and the Idaho Phosphorus Site Index. Now, I'd just like to go back to the nutrient management plan requirements because I think that's the most important and the thing that we changed the most in this permit. We tried to be much more clear or specific in this permit about what our expectations were for nutrient management plans. Each nutrient management plan has to have 9 minimum measures, and rather than go into depth about what's in the permit, I'm just going to mention what those 9 minimum measures are. First measure is ensuring the adequate storage of manure, litter, or processed wastewater in the production area, ensuring the proper management of mortalities, ensuring that clean water is diverted as appropriate from the production area, preventing the direct contact of animals confined or stabled with waters of the United States, ensuring that chemicals and other contaminants are handled on site or not disposed of in any wastewater lagoon, identifying site-specific and appropriate conservation practices to be implemented, identifying protocols for sampling of manure, identifying the protocols for sampling of soil, identifying the protocols for land application of that manure, and then identifying any site-specific records to document the implementation of the nutrient management plan. I mentioned earlier that we did a couple of things to provide some compliance assistance for producers or CAFOs that are covered under this permit. The first is we created a fillable PDF for the annual reporting form. Now, the annual reporting form requires a variety of information, including animal inventory, manure, litter, or processed wastewater generated, production area discharges, the crops and yields that were planted, the manure, litter, and processed wastewater that was applied, the result of soil sample and manure analysis, and the nutrient budgets for the year. We thought that a fillable PDF would help producers put the right information in the right spot and would make it much more quick and easy to turn that form into EPA. The second thing we did was develop record keeping and reporting forms for the daily and weekly inspections that producers do in compliance with this permit. Again, working with the contractor, we developed a series of Google Form templates that could be modified by the producer to help meet the record keeping requirements of the permit. All the producer needs is a Gmail account, and that producer can use these Google Forms to fill out their daily and weekly inspection results, which then feeds into a spreadsheet that compiles all the information for the year. Our hope is that these optional forms will help reduce the record keeping burden on producers that are that have coverage under this general permit. Finally, I mentioned earlier that the CAFO permit did not transfer to the state of Idaho or IDEQ, and here's the reason. Shortly after we published the permit in the Federal Register, an appeal was filed in a Ninth Circuit Court by the Snake River Waterkeeper and Food and Water Watch, and that happened on June 4th of 2020. We have an MOA, or Memorandum of Agreement, with DEQ, where we retain full jurisdiction for permits for which an appeal has been filed. Because we still had responsibility for the CAFO permit when the appeal was filed, we will maintain that responsibility until there's the resolution of the appeal. Once the appeal has been resolved, then we'll transfer the authority for the permit to DEQ. And finally, I'd just like to thank everyone for allowing me to give you this short presentation. Again, my name is Nick Peak. I'm the Ag Advisor for EPA Region 10. My email and my phone number are listed there, so if you have any questions or any other issues you'd like to talk about, please don't hesitate to give me a call. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. We have time for some questions. If anybody would like to put them in the chat box.
So this is Nick. It looks like there's a question about how many producers are going to use the Google Forms. That's a good question. First, we have to get some producers that are covered under the permit. And thus far, there's 0 producers that have applied for the new permit. Perhaps when it transfers to DEQ, that there will be more applications for the permit. The reason we made these forms optional is that anytime you require a form in an NPDES permit that's put out by EPA, it goes through a big review back in Washington, D.C. So we decided to keep these forms optional to assist producers with the record keeping compliance responsibilities, just to forego that review back in headquarters. My hope is that any producer that is covered under the permit would take a look at these optional Google Forms. They're totally customizable for the producer's operation. In addition, the fact that you can summarize the data in a spreadsheet at the end of the year, we're hoping that that'll help alleviate some of the annual reporting burdens that's associated with this permit. So no idea how many producers will sign up or use the forms, but our hope is that if some do sign up, that they will use the forms. Sure. It looks like the question is talking about the lagoon liner requirements for the CAFO permit. The lagoon liner requirements are, I would say, fairly limited because we are not allowed. Let me back up. Under the Clean Water Act, we cannot regulate discharges to groundwater, and so the liner requirements in the permit are pretty general, and we just require facilities to adhere to NRCS conservation practice standards. In addition, producers are asked to evaluate any damage to the liner. And if there is damage to those liners, they have to be evaluated by a professional engineer and corrected within 30 days of the damage, unless the permitting authority, so EPA, approves an alternate schedule. But other than that, the only other thing we request is that any documentation of liner maintenance has to be kept with the NMP. So again, just NRCS practice standards, and that's basically it for the requirements.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
I think we will move on to our next talk. We're running a little bit ahead, but that's okay. And we will have 2 more talks and then a break at 10:50. So the next talk is about the manure share program, and this is by Renee Skaggs, Pierce Conservation District of Washington.
Hi, my name is Renee Skaggs, and I'm the Farm Planning and Agricultural Assistance Program Director for the Pierce Conservation District. And today I'm going to tell you about our manure share program. We've been doing this at Pierce Conservation District for about 20 years. It's a way of nutrient cycling, recycling, and we kind of think of it as a matchmaking service for manure. So if you don't know what conservation districts are and what we do, we're a non-regulatory agency. We've been assisting ag producers with natural resource management and protection since 1949. And with the increasing development over the last 20 years of the Puget Sound region, most farms here are smaller and non-commercial. Many of them are rural lifestyle horse properties, and they often have more livestock than their grass has the capacity to take up those nutrients. So they often generally form really large stockpiles of manure and bedding on their properties. And there's very high transportation costs associated with removing this stockpile from their property. There are lack of composting facilities that will even take manure here, and there are very high tipping fees for manure at the local landfill. But, as you know, if not removed, the stockpile is going to leach nutrients and pathogens, and these are going to get into surface and groundwater and definitely impair water quality. So many crop farms in our local area are down in the valleys, which have very sandy soil, and they definitely need to increase their organic matter for many benefits, one of which is increasing their water holding capacity so they don't have to use as much irrigation water. And there's definitely been in the last 10 years an increase in the number of both organic practicing and certified organic crop farmers here. So they're looking for a lower cost alternative to the very expensive commercial organic fertilizers. And a lot of home gardeners the last probably 10 years have really increased their organic practice methods. So they're also looking for an alternative to commercial organic fertilizers. So what we do, we educate livestock owners on the benefits of and how to compost their manure. It definitely makes it a more desirable product. If it's composted, it's a more stable material. And we do this through educational materials and then also on-farm workshops where we teach them how to do it. We teamed up with WSU Extension last year to hold a 2-day intensive class for on-farm composters. And then we also hold educational events with WSU Extension and do farm walks for crop farmers and teach them how to calculate how much manure that they need to apply on their farms to meet their crop needs. And also importantly, how to calibrate their manure spreaders so they'll know how much manure and nutrients they're putting out there when they're doing their applications. So we maintain a list of farms with excess manure. We advertise to the livestock farmers that we have this avenue for them to get rid of their manure. And then once they're on the list, we advertise this list through our website. We have a Pierce Poo Placement Program Facebook page. It's a catchy name there. We advertise that we have the list on Craigslist, to garden clubs, through the Master Gardeners, and then also through our Harvest Pierce County program, which works with a lot of community gardens. So then once manure seekers obtain this list, they contact the farm owners to arrange the pickup and or delivery of their material. So there are impediments to the program. We would like to increase its reach, but many livestock owners, one of the problems is they don't have a way to deliver large quantities of manure. They maybe have a pickup truck, but it is expensive to hire a dump truck. Many crop owners also don't have manure spreaders, and we don't have any local custom farmers with large spreaders. The Conservation District has 2 very small manure spreaders, but they're pretty small for large applications. So we are seeking funding to purchase a larger spreader, and maybe that could be live with a co-op. It can be shared by farmers. And then we're also working with our county government to locate a central location where livestock owners could take their manure and pickup could happen by crop farmers and gardeners, and maybe find an entrepreneur out there that is interested in becoming this manure transportation facilitator. So thank you for attending, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. You've left yourself lots of time for questions.
Thanks, Sherry, for the question. Is supply meeting demand? Not really. On the presentation on Monday, I can't remember who it was. They said that most parts of the country don't have enough manure to meet the demand, but it showed on the map right around the Puget Sound, King County, and Pierce County, there's plenty of material to cover all of our crop farms, but we still have a higher supply than demand. That's why we've started doing the classes for crop farmers to educate them and encourage them to use manure on their crop fields. But definitely, like I said, the transportation is one of the big issues, and we would like to incorporate a tracking system to find out how much manure is actually leaving these farms. So I see there's another question from Doug. Can you comment on the different types of manure and which have highest demand? Example, horse versus cow versus sheep. So most of our supply is from horse farms, but as you guys probably all know, it's very low in nitrogen, and a lot of the farms, even though we're trying to encourage them to use less bedding, they use a huge amount of bedding, and that really throws off their carbon and nitrogen ratio. So crop farmers or even home gardeners aren't going to want to tie up their nitrogen. So we definitely always have people looking for chicken manure, which there's farms in the area with chicken manure, especially Wilcox. But a lot of the horse manure is what's readily available, and it's a lot of times not good to use for all the reasons I said. We got a couple more questions. Let me go back up here. We just wrapped up our program here and are looking to partner with our local FFA or 4-H to deliver and run this program for donations. That's Michael Hipp from Snohomish. That's a great idea. And Wim is asking about how many tons a year go out. So yeah, Wim, that is a good question. I would like to know that. We've thought about using one of our AmeriCorps members to call all of our members on the manure share list and ask them. So we've thought about it, haven't done it, but I'm definitely going to take that into consideration in the future. I think we should start tracking this. And Sherry's asking, any concerns with persistent herbicides, or is buyer beware? So there used to be clopyralid issues with hay coming from central and eastern Washington that were treated with that. That is definitely reduced, but every once in a while, maybe 2 years ago, there was a farm that did get some clopyralid infected material, and it killed all their tomato plants. Whenever I send out the list to farms, I also send the information on clopyralid, as a just in case, but it comes up so infrequently now, there isn't a huge issue, but I still let people know. But it's definitely buyer beware. And they could do a little test, on some tomato starts to find out. So Jane is asking, is there testing required of the compost and manure? What do they test for, and who is responsible for the testing? So we are not providing any testing of the manure unless we have landowners asking for that. We do have a first 5 free soil testing program, and we extended that to test compost and manure. I took a sample yesterday. A landowner got some separated solids from a dairy that didn't have any tests available for him. So we're going to test that so he'll know for sure what he's putting on. But right now we don't have anyone doing that. If it were a CAFO involved operation, I'm sure there'd have to be testing, as we just heard. Michael's asking, have you explored using horse manure for compact pack bedding for cows? We have one cooperator in Oso doing that now. Yeah, I do know about that. We only have one operational dairy in our county right now, so or using it for bedding wouldn't, use very much around here. And I do know that there are some of the compost, I can't remember what they're called. I know you guys have them in Snohomish, Michael, the compost in a box basically that will turn bedding with a little bit of manure in it into clean bedding. And as far as I know, we don't have any of those in operation right now in Pierce County. So Doug's saying, you said tipping fees at landfills were high. Is it legal to landfill manure? Yes, it is. It's legal, and that's what some farms around here are doing. They're taking it to landfills. Jay's saying at a crop farmer that did not want to spread the ivermectin on their farm, which is a dewormer, which if it is composted, from what I understand, it does break down in the composting process. But I know you would definitely have to make sure you're composting it and not just piling it up and letting it sit there and calling that composting. Thanks for all the questions.
Okay, any other questions? I'll give it a minute. Okay, Renee, thank you.
All right, thanks for your interest, everyone.
And we will move on. Again, we're running a little bit ahead, but that's okay. This will be our last talk before our bio break. And this one is by Mario De Haro, The Magic Valley, Idaho under 6 different future scenarios. Oh, sorry. Hold on a second.
Hello, my name is Mario De Marti. I'm an extension educator in Gooding County in southern Idaho, serving the Magic Valley. And today I'm going to talk about a project we work on food, energy, and water system FUSE, an analysis and co-development of integrated solutions to maintain the agricultural production and resilience in the Magic Valley. Under 6 different future scenarios. First of all, I want to acknowledge my co-authors and colleagues, and this is a portion of the team that work on this project. The take-home point is that the dairy production and processing drives the Magic Valley and the state economy in the ag sector right now and in most of the scenarios. We identified, integrate among them, and rank more than 90 solutions for nutrients, water, and energy and industry operations within the project to fit on the different scenarios. And the FUSE in the Magic Valley have embedded resilience, so the system have resilience. With this project, we demonstrated that. And part of that resilience is based on the diversity that we have in the valley and the agriculture sector. So that allows it to react to various disturbances. So the scenarios were set to a horizon of 2050. We achieve these scenarios, or we arrive to these with the participation of a very active stakeholder group that helped to determine not only the scenarios, but the drivers of those scenarios, what changes those drivers bring, and work on the solutions. All the scenarios were based with the stakeholders, but also on modeling from climatological, water data, sociological, production, and economic models. How those affect the food, energy, and water. And within the water is the byproducts and wastewater from different industries in the valley. We developed these 6 scenarios. So the first one is the business as usual. What happens if we continue doing what we are doing? Over there, there is included some changes due to climate change, but and population growth, etc. But what happens if we continue the path that we have right now? On the second scenario, we have we put names to short them and kind of have an evident explanation. We call the second scenario the court call, and basically is what happens if we have an increase in shore water years that is not really dramatic, but is enough to trigger the curtailment of the junior water users. That comes coupled with an increase in summer temperatures, so it's a decrease in water availability and increase in summer temperatures, and a moderate population increase due to even other parts having a little bit of a struggle sometimes. So in this case, agriculture and cities need a major adaptation. And the third scenario, we call it the locavore, basically is a scenario where we have more water availability. There is an increase in population beyond the business as usual model or projections, but the people who are arriving have higher income. There is some industrial change or some way of living change. So this new population looks for quality of life and care about mostly environmental protection and recreation on this area they live now. The fourth scenario is population boom. What happens is we still have a stable water supply, but we have a dramatic increase in population. This is way beyond the business as usual. And that population is driven by establishment of alternative industry that there are non-agriculture. Think about the explosion of technology related industries like Magic Valley becomes a second Silicon Valley. So there is a huge competition from these industries and from the population, from the cities, a huge competition for land and water and other resources. The fifth scenario is the mega drought. So what happens if we have a constant or repeating decadal drought that is way beyond any normal? For this, we took basically we took the Dust Bowl drought and increased that with climate change references in the model. So it's beyond what we have seen before. But that creates an international disruption of the markets at global level, high energy costs because the lack of water to generate electricity in our region, and most of the electricity is hydropower. So some alternative industries slowly replace some agriculture, but a dramatic adaptation for agriculture and the cities is needed. And then the final scenario, we call it Happy Valley, the scenario 6, then where we have a stable water availability in the basin, but the rest of the country and the world are not doing very good. There is a lack of water in the rest of the parts of the world and the country. Their agriculture start collapsing. So suddenly the Magic Valley becomes the breadbasket of the country. So that has some national security implications, which gives agriculture the maximum protections possible, and all the industries associated with agriculture too. So the project developed those scenario analysis with an emphasis on the drivers, the water, the energy, the population, the economy, the byproducts, and changes on those. And what are per scenario the main adaptive solutions? We in total put a list together of more than 90 solutions. But per scenario and per area, we concentrated on the top 10 to 15 solutions. But the total list of scenarios is much larger, but some of them those solutions have very minor effects, so we leave them kind of on the side. So per scenario, we develop this kind of graphics. So in this one, we show, for example, this is business as usual, how the population, and this is our reference scenario, how the population grows, and here, and what's the variability on the water if we have low water years or higher water years. And we mention what are the main changes that happen around and what are the main solutions. On top of that, we generate a list of the expanded list of solutions. So the business as usual mostly concentrates on dairy efficiency and the regular things we are doing with water, again, plus the climate change effect and on Horizon 2050. So what happened with the scenario 2, the court calls? In this case, again, we have some population growth. The solutions and the changes include some conversions on land and other uses. We start seeing more fallow ground and higher energy costs because of the lack of water. Because we are on a drought situation in this case, the solutions that are related to water quantity and keep the water quality start piling up, as well as the ones with the energy. In that case, the treatment of byproducts from the agricultural sector is low because we have bigger problems to solve here. Same thing with crops. Crops came a little bit under scrutiny because they need to reduce the water usage. And dairy efficiency is also related to maintain production with less water and with higher temperatures. In the locavore, again, we see an expansion of population beyond the business as usual. This is more population. The water situation is good here, we see. So we see an flourishing of the small farms on this one because people are requiring those fresh products and locally produced products. In this case, the byproduct list, what we do with our manure and other byproducts become very, very long because again, it's population driven. The society requires us to do that, and the industry reacts accordingly. Also, there are some more density on the cities, and we start seeing more variables that needs to be modified. And the water, because we have a good amount of water, we start focusing on water quality BMPs. And the population boom, again, we see population projections way beyond the business as usual. And in this case, the water situation is good, but we have competition between high income industries and the agriculture sector. So there is a shift on the use of the water because we start use the water for generating more electricity. And in this case, we're gonna see that renewable energies also become more appealing because we have high energy demands. We have more techniques to do to generate energy on a sustainable way that now become more appealing. There is a push because we have more people in the cities. There is a push on water quantity and water quality, but it's driven also in urban areas, and a competition between the agricultural sector and the industrial sector in this case. So on the dairy sector, they need to react in this case by consolidating and start doing management on their byproduct that reduces emissions because they start getting more encroached and there is more population around. On the mega drought, this affects everybody as well with the previous scenario 4 on population boom and mega drought. Those are the two that reduce and the dairy industry really affect the dairy industry and the agricultural sector in general. In this case, well, we throw the kitchen sink here on the water. You're gonna see we are in a really, really bad situation on water. Even our population there is a growth, but it's not as expected, except that there are a lot of people moving because some people moving here because in other places things are a little worse. Again, on the water side, all hands on deck is here. Everything that is available, we are applied to reduce the water use, to increase the water recharge. In the case of both cases of the drought, the aquifer became a storage place, and any other storage that we can have with the few water available, the little water available, the few snow and rainfalls available will be applied. The byproducts concentrate on nutrient recycling and nutrient extraction. And because of the lack of water, and again, alternative energy generation becomes important on this. Again, the dairy industry and agriculture in general suffers greatly under this scenario. And the final scenario, the Happy Valley, our water situation is good, our population is growing, and our situation is in water, even when we have some deficits, is good compared to the rest of the country and the world. So in this case, everybody is in a severe drought except us. So suddenly, we become the breadbasket of the country, and we have agricultural protection zones and different methods to protect and increase even agriculture. Again, water quantity, water quality, but all referring to supporting agriculture, even an expansion as much as possible of agriculture. Every single space available become available for farming. And in this case, the byproducts, there is not much there because the production is the most important part. The take-home point is that some scenarios bring the development and implementation of solutions that nowadays are not possible or not appealing because of the economy, lack of interest, or they are not applicable in the region under the actual conditions, and those scenarios become more attractive. There are two scenarios, the mega drought and the population boom that reduce the dairy production greatly, and the three scenarios that keep showing the dairy production as the leading sector. Dairy production and processing, anyways, drive the economy now and in most of the scenarios. And again, we have a good resilience in the valley, in the agricultural sector, and a diversity that they allow us to have that resilience. I want to announce the funding provided by NSF grant, and thank you to the stakeholder group meetings and the Infuse team. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Mario. It was very interesting. Go back.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions for Mario.
Well, there is a question. It says not to be cynical, but how realistic is the Happy Valley scenario? Actually, the Magic Valley, at least in Idaho, drives the economy on the agricultural sector. Around 70% of the 60 to 70% of the farm products are sales come from the Magic Valley. And again, we proved that with the water system, the water management we have, we do have a high resilience to disturbances in the system. So it was plausible that other sector of the country have trouble under some drought conditions. And when we saw that a couple of years ago, when there was drought in California and Texas, and for example, our hay prices were really high. So if we prolong that over the years, that could become a very plausible scenario. And one of the things we saw on that scenario is some of the drawbacks that we, for example, of transportation on produce and products, processes, product to get them out of the valley, you know, in that case. So the other thing I want to mention is we worked with this with the stakeholders three years. So we saw all these scenarios, and again, some of them didn't look very plausible at the beginning, but we say, well, let's keep working on them, because we based those on the different models we use, the sociological models, especially the water-based model. And when we finished, the closing meeting was scheduled for beginning of 2020. So we basically closed the project in 2019. I think that nobody imagined that would come in 2020 with COVID-19. So kind of what is happening now validates some of those scenarios in the way that are possible. You know, some of the components on the scenario 3, the locavore, were present now during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, suddenly, especially at the beginning when we have shutdowns and many activities were closed, the kind of the local producing industry got the bloom on the beginning of 2020 with CSAs and small producers being sold out because people were looking for local products. So it's possible. We need to not underestimate those scenarios, because they are quite possible.
Yeah, that's a good point. You didn't foresee a worldwide pandemic in your scenarios.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we brought that to the table at some point, people would say, "Well, you are out of your mind," and well, look where we are now.
Very interesting. Any other questions?
Everybody needs a break.
Yeah, thank you, Mario. Before everybody goes, our first speaker, Pradeep, wanted to clarify something. Pradeep, yeah. Take the floor, and maybe you can put some context into what you're saying.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Pradeep once again. I would like to clarify my previous statement regarding the Idaho State Department of Agriculture regulation of third-party receivers. I was kind of incorrect when I stated that ISDA is looking to regulate third-party receivers in the near future. That is not true. Third-party reviewers of nutrients and byproducts are not currently within the scope of Idaho State Department of Agriculture Regulatory Authority, and any changes to the scope of the ISDA authority will be determined by policymaker outside of the ISDA. The ISDA role is to implement not determine the policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I don't see any follow-up questions to that.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay,
Thank you.
so we will take a break now. I'll pause the recording and then I'll initiate it again. And we will start at 11:10 with Jai Lin talking about key components and contrasts in the nitrogen budget across a US-Canadian transboundary watershed. So we will see you all again at 11:10. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to the nutrient management, cover crops, and environmental monitoring session. And we are going to kick off the second half of the morning session with Jai Lin from the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk on key components and the contrast in the nitrogen budget across the US-Canada transboundary watershed and links to Puget Sound. My name is Jia Lin. I'm an ORISE postdoc currently based at EPA Corvallis, Oregon lab. First, I want to thank my collaborators. They're from federal and local agencies such as Department of Ecology, WSDA, Whatcom Conservation District, and then Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I also got a lot of help from the university and the tribal folks. The work has recently been published in JGR Biogeosciences. And in case you're curious, here's our publication information. So the watershed we study is the Nooksack River watershed. It's at the border of Washington State and BC, Canada. There is a wide variety of land uses within the watershed. Majority of the land is forested land, but the lower flatland is mainly agricultural land with some very high intensity management. There are differences in policy and the management between the US side and Canadian side of the watershed. And there are also the Lamination and Nooksack tribe within this area. In this region, there have been some prolonged nitrogen-related issues, such as elevated nitrate level in the groundwater or drinking water wells. A significant portion of the wells have nitrate level exceeding the 10 milligram per liter standard. There are also surface water quality issues, and these got more complicated because of the cross-border, the transboundary nature of this area. So what I'm showing here is not just nitrogen, but also other issues such as bacteria, DO level, temperature, and these are in combination are impacting the salmon habitat and shellfish production. There are also air quality issues mainly related to visibility and odor. The elevated nitrogen deposition can also have ecological impact on the forest land, as well as effects on public health and human activities. So in order to better understand the nitrogen process within the watershed, we developed this comprehensive nitrogen inventory using mainly local data. So basically we quantified the input of nitrogen to the watershed and also the export. But there are also a lot of process like nitrogen recycling within the watershed boundary, and we also quantify those fluxes. So we share the information among stakeholders in order to get a wide range of feedbacks and the perspective and their help. So the goal eventually is to identify and evaluate solutions that can be useful to the local communities. So this is a final models that we use to calculate these different budget components. The orange bubbles are showing the inputs to the watershed, and the green bubbles are the output, and the dashed line represent the watershed boundary. So for the inputs, we look at biological and fixation, mainly from the red alders, which can be a very effective nitrogen fixer. And then we also look at the food import for human and then pets, mainly cats and dogs. We calculated feed import for the livestock, and also the fertilizer import for the crops. And for the export, we also look at atmospheric deposition using results from the EPA CMAQ model. We also, for the output, we look at the volatilization loss and denitrification losses from the ag land, and also the animal product and the crop product export. We also have this salmon piece, because at the beginning of the project, we have tribal collaborators showing that they're very interested in knowing how much nitrogen fluxes that are associated with the salmon comparing to the different nitrogen fluxes. And that's why we include this salmon piece. So I'm not going to go into details about these tables, but it's just showing like different components included in the nitrogen budget and how we calculated them and where we got all data sources. So if you are interested in knowing more about this information, feel free to ask me questions or check out our paper. So I'm going to go directly into our results. So this is the plot showing the general nitrogen flows in the Nooksack River watershed. So the Sankey plot, on the left side, these are different input components, and on the right side, these are the export components, as well as this retention piece. So you can view the Sankey plot as nitrogen flowing from the left side to the right side and exiting the watershed. And then these bars are, the size of the bars are proportional to the magnitude of the nitrogen fluxes. So you can see that for the input, 81% of the input were used to support agriculture, and then it's mostly animal feed to dairy and poultry. The total input rate is about 50 kilogram nitrogen per hectare for the entire watershed. And export rates are about equal between ammonia emission, animal product export, and the riverine export. So it's like roughly 25 to 30% each. And this retention piece is calculated as the difference between total input and this non-existing export. Basically the retention is the piece that we're unable to quantify for now, and then that's the amount of nitrogen that can end up in soil, groundwater, or additional gaseous loss. So here are some more results, and then it's broken into the Canadian side and US side of the border. The red color is Canada side of the border, and then the blue color is the US portion of the watershed. So again, you can see that the feed import is the biggest piece, and then it's mainly dairy on the US side, and then mainly poultry on the Canadian side, and they're about the same. So feed import is the biggest source, and then followed by fertilizer import, which is about 21% of total input. Atmospheric deposition is about 10% of the total input, and a similar amount for food import for human and pets. And then the nitrogen fluxes associated with the fish return or biological and fixations are very small. They're both about less than 1% of the total inputs. And here are the results on the outputs. And again, on the US side, it's mainly associated with the dairy product export. And then on the Canadian side, it's associated with the poultry product export. Volatilization loss is actually the largest in export, which is about 32% of total export, and it's mainly on the US side. So in terms of the loss path, in the US side of the watershed, it's mainly through ammonia volatilization loss or riverine export. But on the Canadian side, it's mainly through animal products export. So a huge portion of the nitrogen in the Canadian side of the border, Canadian side of the watershed is actually unknown or going to retention. So potentially end up in this shared aquifer. And these are the results on internal fluxes. So you will notice that the crop product export is very small here. And that's because most of the crop is used as animal feed. And it's mainly in the US side. But in return, there's a lot of manure application. So that's returning nitrogen back to this cropland. And again, retention is about 20% of total input. And it's a similar amount to the annual riverine export of TN. So in addition to the nitrogen fluxes, we also calculated nitrogen use efficiency. When examining NUE in these ag systems, it's important to consider NUE at the crop or animal level and for the whole system. So we calculated NUE in 3 different ways. So the top one is just crop NUE, and it's calculated as crop export divided by applied manure and synthetic fertilizer. So the crop NUE can help interpret efficiency of cropping systems and the potential losses related to nitrogen. We also calculated the farm gate NUE. So as the total export of crop and animal products divided by all the inputs combined, so deposition, elder fixation, import fertilizer, etc. So farm gate NUE can provide information on both agronomic efficiency and environmental risks for the whole watershed, and it has been used as a policy instrument and the basis for a lot of regulations. And lastly, we calculate the commercial NUE, which is the total export of crop and animal products divided by import of feed and the fertilizer. So it excludes the free nitrogen input and it mitigates the need to account for inputs beyond the farmer's control, such as deposition and BNF. So it helps with the assessment of economic consequences. And these are the results on the NUE, and it's not just for the whole watershed, but it's further broken down into NUE on the US side and the NUE on the Canadian side. So these 2 sides of the border have similar climate and physiography. So it's a great opportunity for us to study the contrast in ag management and NUE. And these differences are driven by types of animals and crops, as well as by manure management regulations and the farm economies. So if you just look at crop NUE alone, the whole watershed has a NUE, crop NUE of about 67%, and that's similar to the national average. US side has a higher crop NUE compared to the Canadian side, and that's because US side has a more strict manure regulations, but also it's because the crops grown on the US side have really high nitrogen content, such as grass, hay, or corn, versus the Canadian side mainly grow like berries, which is known to have very, very low nitrogen content. And when you look at the farm gate NUE or the commercial whole farm NUE, the Canadian side is doing much better than the US side. And then there are several reasons for that. So Canadian side has a lower dairy stocking rate. It's about 2.5 cows per hectare versus 3.2 per hectare on the US side. So lower stocking rates means it requires less feed import because local feed is sufficient. And they also reuse a lot of local nitrogen for the poultry industry. For example, they can use rendering products, but we cannot do that for the dairy industry here on the US side. So these combined help increase the NUE on the Canadian side. But I think we should think about like these livestock only farms should be accountable for nitrogen loss upstreams, and then we should account for all these different inputs, even though they are like outside the watershed boundaries. So here are my conclusions. Agriculture was the primary driver of nitrogen inputs to the environment. Export was about 80% of total input, driven by ammonium emission and animal product export. Riverine export of nitrogen was estimated about 28% of total N export. And then crop NUE alone cannot provide enough information on the farming activities, and it should be combined with other criteria. And much information can inform management to minimize nitrogen losses. And it provides a lot of key information for stakeholders across different sectors and borders. And lastly, I think there's some opportunities to make this connection between our project to the Puget Sound Nutrient Reduction Project. So currently they're using the CLHC model to guide a lot of target and then actions, but I think from our NUCSAC budget, we can also provide a lot of useful information, such as where do you get data and how do you establish this nitrogen budget for different sites across the Sound, and then use this information to help establish realistic reduction goals and then answer questions as such as how communities can achieve these reduction goals. And with that, thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thank you. Please type questions in the chat box if you have them.
Doug asked a question, can you elaborate on the large amount of ammonium volatilization, where is this happening? So this is mainly associated with the fertilizer application. At the beginning of the slide, there's a map of the watershed showing where the grass and the corn were grown. So that's about 10% of the watershed at the downstream portion, and that's where most of the dairy manure was applied, and that's where most of this volatilization is happening. And a lot of these manure are produced locally, and then yeah.
At the time of fertilization, or?
So it's there are several stages. I believe everyone here is more expert than me on this, but they're like volatilization happening during like the production and then the storage and then the housing and then after they are spread it on the field. So they are like different stages, and all these are calculated and then combined. That's why the amount is so large.
Okay. you have a few more questions too.
So there's a question about the riverine loss. So it's the data, the concentration and the discharge data is based on the USGS gauge on the Nooksack River. There are two stations. One is more upstream, almost at the border of the forest portion and the ag portion, and another one is at the downstream portion of the Nooksack River. So we use the USGS model WRTDS to simulate the riverine nitrogen flux. So it's we didn't take the sample, but USGS did. And then Wim had a question: if it's an increasing atmospheric deposition over time in projects that report this metric. What do you mean by this metric? So the data that we use for this model, for this work is from the EPA CMAQ modeling. So there was the animation at the beginning showing the changing of the ammonium deposition in this watershed. And you can see that it's increasing during like summertime. And then you can see like a red dot forming, but I don't know if that's what Wim's asking. I think is it specific for this region or for the, so I think there are studies showing that for the whole US, the ammonium deposition is almost increasing, contrast to the decreasing trend for the nitrate because of the Clean Air Act. So we actually see increasing ammonium deposition. That's like long-term trend. And our study is mainly constrained to just 1 year of a period. So there's some fluctuation over the annual period, but we didn't get to do a trend analysis for atmospheric deposition over like a longer period. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving right along, our next speaker will be Asmita Shapagan. Does a fall planted cover crop impact soil fertility management?
Hi, I'm Asmita Chapagai, and I'm going to discuss about does a fall planted cover crop impact soil fertility management? Let's start with soil fertility. It is the ability of soil to sustain crop growth and development. What makes the soil fertile is the availability of essential nutrients and the lack of toxic elements. So how do we maintain soil fertility? Soil can be made fertile by adopting practices that add nutrients to the soil, as well as by following practices that actually help prevent the loss of nutrients. Soil fertility management practices are common and as simple as addition of manure to the field or the addition of inorganic fertilizers. The soil fertility can as well be maintained by irrigating the field because it helps augment the soil moisture to a level preferred by the specific crops. Soil fertility can also be managed using some sustainable techniques like the application of cover crop. Cover crops are simply the crops covering the surface of our soil. They help manage soil fertility by adding moisture to the soil, supplementing nitrogen to the soil, maintaining diversity of soil biota, sequestration of carbon, helping to control soil erosion, minimizing soil compaction, improving soil aggregation, and regulating soil temperature. Although not all the methods listed here do increase the nutrient contents, but surely they lead to a greater availability of nutrients to our crops. During the winter, when the temperature drops down below freezing point, soil is covered with snow. During that period, the growth and development of our plant is halted. In such a case, plants essentially do not require any nutrients when they are affected, especially by frost. So, do our soil retain all the nutrients during this dormant period? To evaluate this, we conducted an experiment to evaluate the need for spring fertilizer reapplication following fall planted cover crop. The experiment was conducted in Kimberley Research and Extension Center, located at an altitude of 3,924 feet. The region has an annual precipitation of 9.42 inches. The soil is in the order arid soil, and the climate is semi-arid in the region. For the experiment, we used randomized complete block design with 10 treatments and 6 replications. Our control was a fallow with no irrigation as well as no fertilizer. Irrigation and fertilizer were our 2 factors with low, medium, and high levels of each. For field preparation, we performed tillage using a moldboard plow. After that, we applied glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup, as a broad spectrum herbicide to control weed. We used urea having 46% of nitrogen as our fertilizer. Low, medium, and high level of fertilizer was maintained at 0, 45, and 90 pounds per acre of nitrogen. After fertilization, round harrow was used to distribute it evenly throughout the field and also to level the land so it will be easier for us for cultural practices. The seeding was done with a mixed cover crop seed. For rapid germination, irrigation was applied to all the treatments equally at the initial phase at a level of 1 inch approximately. After that, low, medium, and high level of irrigation was allotted at 14, 10, and 7 days interval respectively. The plantation date of the cover crop was September 16 of 2019. And the day of first frost was 14th of October. So you can see that we only had a small window period for our cover crop to actually grow. The first sampling was done on fall 2019 after first hard frost, whereas the second sampling was done in the spring of 2020 before the cover crop started growing back again. We used bucket auger for sampling the soil. After that, the samples were analyzed in the lab for salt, ammonium, and nitrate concentration. The data we obtained was then analyzed using SAS. ANOVA was performed for all sets of data. Here in the table, you can see the list of data analyzed and the sections where they were significant at the level P lesser than 0.05. In the figure where the tick mark is present, the data was statistically significant as at P lesser than 0.05. None of the components were significant for the interaction of treatment and time, so we would not be discussing this in our presentation. Electrical conductivity, nitrate, and plant available nitrogen was significant for treatment as well as the time, but ammonia was not significant for any. The graph you can see now is the graph for the average electrical conductivity among the treatments. Similar alphabets at the top of the graph denote no statistical difference. From the figure, there is no clear group distinction among the treatments. The graph you can see now is the graph for average nitrate concentration among the treatments. The alphabets in the graph separate the group on hierarchy. Similar alphabet means statistically same level. Here B is superior to A, or B has the highest average nitrate concentration than A. This graph shows the average plant available nitrogen. Here, when we say plant available nitrogen, we are talking about the combination of ammonium and the nitrate. Similar alphabets mean that the two groups are statistically at par or are at the same level, and B is superior to A, means B has the higher plant available nitrogen than A. This graph over here shows the difference in electrical conductivity between the fall of 2019 and spring of 2020. The fall is superior to spring with higher electrical conductivity, thus higher salt concentration. The next graph over here shows the average nitrate concentration as well as the average plant available nitrogen concentration in between the fall of 2019 and the spring of 2020. It is clear from the graph that both the concentration of nitrate and plant available nitrogen was greater in the fall of 2019 than that of spring 2020. Although ammonium was not significant for anything, in one of the treatments, the ammonium concentration was higher than that of the fall. Although the treatments were statistically the same. So what actually caused the decrease in nutrients over the winter? The answer is leaching. As you can see from the figure, the clay particles have negative charge in them. They strongly attack the positively charged ammonium, whereas repel the negatively charged nitrate. This is the reason why ammonium doesn't leach out, but it is strongly attached to the clay. But our nitrate do leach out when there is water available. And that's why the nitrate concentration was greatly reduced in the spring than that of the fall. In the case of salt, the basic radical, although having the positive charge, is weakly bonded to the clay particles as it forms ionic bond rather than a covalent bond that are easier to break in a solution. Acidic radicals in the salt are positively charged. The salts, when comes in contact with water, dissolves in it rapidly and leaches out. Leaching is also the reason for water pollution in underground or the groundwater. So we can conclude that no matter the amount of fertilizer we apply in the fall, the nutrients are leached out and are not available for our next cash crop. Fertilizer reapplication becomes necessary at this point. The application of fertilizer in the fall, just prior to the frost, only means loss in the investment and the salts, nitrate, and all the money, and everything ends up in the drain. The leaching of the nutrients also leads to water pollution. So higher the fertilizer used that gets leached, more the chances of polluting the groundwater. Although there was difference in irrigation level, it was not proportional to the loss of nutrients. So more water doesn't always mean that more of the nutrients are gonna get leached out. And more fertilizer in the fall doesn't always mean that more fertilizer is available to us in the spring. This is all. Thank you.
Thanks, Asmita. Got time for some questions if people want to put them in the chat box, please.
Actually, our control did not receive any fertilizer, but it also did not receive any irrigation. So probably, I mean, the lesser the water, it didn't actually leach out.
I also had a question about irrigation. Did you irrigate after the frost? Like you irrigated throughout the winter?
No, we actually stopped the irrigation after the frost, but generally around here, winter is the time for maximum precipitation to occur. So I guess precipitation was adding to the losses.
How much precipitation do you receive or did you receive?
I'm not sure about the numbers, but it was around, it must be around the average range because we don't really receive any precipitation other time of the year.
Mm-hmm. Give it a second if anybody has any more questions. We have time for another one. Okay, thank you very much, Asmita.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Jennifer Yost, the effect of manure and cover crops on soil physical properties on aridosols in southern Idaho.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my presentation. My name is Jennifer Yost, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Idaho, down at the Twin Falls R&E Center, and I'm part of the Department of Soil and Water Systems. The project that I will be talking to you about today is in collaboration with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. And the title of my presentation is The Effects of Manure and Cover Crop on Soil Physical Properties on Aridosols down in southern Idaho. So to start, research has shown, and it's also kind of hypothesized still, that cover crops are able to help retain soil moisture And this is because the cover crop is able to provide ground coverage because of the above ground biomass. And this ground coverage is able to decrease the amount of water that's being evaporated off of the soil surface, therefore allowing the soil to retain more moisture. There's also been research that has looked at manure applications to the soil surface. And usually when manure is applied, there have been increases in soil moisture. And this is just due to the increase in the organic matter and the organic carbon in the topsoil. Now, this hasn't been shown in all soil types, primarily in coarser, so very sandy soils, or in silty soils. But regardless, the cover crop and the manure application practices haven't really been evaluated down in southern Idaho and various in the semi-arid and irrigated crop production region. So the overall goal of the study was to determine if manure and/or cover crops are able to increase the amount of water that is being held in the soil. And we did this at 2 long-term research study sites down in southern Idaho. We also were interested to see that if manure and/or cover crops influenced the soil physical properties as a whole in these systems. So like I said, we were looking at 2 different study sites. The first one is cover crop. So both of the study sites were done at ARS's Northwest Irrigation and Soils Research Farm, and this is out in Kimberly, Idaho. The cover crop study was started in 2016. The cash crop that is used throughout the growing season is silage corn, and the cover crop is a winter forage species, which is triticale. So the triticale is planted right after harvesting the silage corn. And it grows throughout the season or throughout the winter, and then is harvested right before silage corn is planted the next year. So this study site was set up as a split plot design. So if you see the figure on the bottom left, you're able to see that there are 4 different blocks. So this is a split plot with 4 replicates. There are 2 main experimental treatments, and that is based on tillage. So we're considering the direct seeding to be a no-till system, while the chisel and plow, or chisel and disc plowed system, is going to be the conventional tillage method. So you're able to see that in each block, 4 plots are going to be conventional till, the other 4 are going to be limited/no-till. And then within those, we have 4 different sub-treatments. 2 of them incorporate cover crop, either with or without dairy manure. And then the last 2 are going to be no cover crop with or without manure. So if you see M, it means that manure was applied. NM is going to be no manure. CC is cover crop. NCC is no cover crop. In the plots that didn't receive manure or have cover crops, it is considered to be our control. The second study site was also at the ARS Northwest Irrigation and Soils Research Farm in southern Idaho. So this is the long-term manure study. This one was set up slightly different. So this was a randomized complete block design. This one was started in 2013. And the crop rotation for this system is wheat to potato to barley to sugar beet. So for this year, when we collected our data from it, this was in year 8, so this was under sugar beet. And for here we have 8 different treatments. The first one is a control, so there was no dairy manure or fertilizer applied to that soil. There was a fertilizer only plot, and then we had 3 different amounts of dairy manure applied to the soil. We applied 10, 20, or 30 tons of manure per acre. And we did this on Three of the treatments are on an annual basis and 3 of them are on biennial. So we had 4 replications of each of these different treatments. And we were really interested to see how much manure should be applied to these soils and how often it should be applied in order to see differences in the soil physical properties. So we collected measurements using 3 different instruments. So we collected bulk density from 0 to 2, 2 to 4, and 4 to 6 inches. And that was just using rings that you push into the soil that have a specific volume. We use a Cornell sprinkle infiltrometer to measure the runoff rate, the infiltration rate, and the amount of rainfall that is able to occur prior to the soils running off. Then we also measured saturated hydraulic conductivity out in the field using a Saturo. And this is just a picture of what the corn looked like about a week or so before we went out to measure, take these measurements. So for the cover crop site, we went out and took soil physical property measurements just before the corn started tasseling in some of the treatments. And then for the long-term manure, we sampled about a week or 2 prior to the sugar beets being under full canopy. So for both of them, it was mid-season. So the first set of data I'm going to share with you is bulk density. For cover crop, bulk density was significantly different between 0 and 2 inches. So that's the graph I'm going to be sharing with you right now. And for here, so you're going to see the bulk density on the y-axis, and that's measured in milligram or megagrams per meter cube, and the different treatments on the x-axis. So if you remember, M is going to be manured plots, NM is no manure, then CC is cover crop, and CC is no cover crop. So for here, in the top 2 inches of the soil, you're able to see that when manure is applied, the bulk density tends to be lower. And that's just because the bulk density tends to be lower when there is a lot more carbon being entered into the system. So just applying the manure is going to help decrease the density of the soil. And you're able to see that the no manure, no cover crop was significantly higher than the manured plots. And that's just because there's more than likely a decrease in the amount of organic carbon that's present in the soil. So for the long-term manure study, again, the treatment is on the x-axis, and the A is going to stand for when the manure is applied annually, and the B is when it's applied biannually. For here, the 0 to 2 and 2 to 4 inches for bulk density were not significant. We only saw differences between 4 and 6 inches. Again, this is a megagram per meter cube. And when you're looking at the graph, also, when you look at the graph, if you see letters that are the same between treatments, it means that they are not significantly different. And when you do see different letters, so just like, for example, the 30 tons applied annually is significantly different than when only 10 tons of manure is applied on an annual basis. And they also have different letters that signify that they're significantly different. So for here, you're able to see that a majority of the different treatments had approximately the same bulk density. It was only when the 30 tons of manure was applied on an annual basis that it was, you're able to see an increase in the organic matter, which is obviously decreasing the density of the soil. And when 10 tons of manure is applied either on an annual or biennial basis, that tended to be significantly higher than the 30 tons applied annually. The next graph I'm going to show is the runoff rate. So this is the runoff rate in inches per hour for cover crop. you're able to see that there are no significant differences between the different treatments for runoff rate. So you can't exactly say if the manure or the cover crop plots are helping or decreasing the amount of water that's running off. The same thing was found for the long-term manure. So there were no significant differences for the runoff rate. And the variation, which is going to be the bars, is actually really high for these data sets. So unfortunately, even with the different treatments, the variation between the data points was still so great that there's really no difference when it comes to whether manure or cover crops are there. The runoff is going to be about the same. Now, this is the infiltration rate, so the amount of water that's able to infiltrate through the soil. And for here, you're also able to see that even the infiltration rate didn't seem to matter. So there's actually less variation for cover crop. They were all about the same, and the errors were about the same. And same with the long-term manure. So at least when we collected these in the mid-season, it looks like that the infiltration rate didn't really make a difference based off of treatment. So now we're going to move into the amount of water the soil that is able to infiltrate through the soil prior to runoff. So for cover crop, and this is going to be measured in inches, for the cover crop site, you're able to see that the manure cover crop is able to accept a lot more water before it starts running off. So for here, those plots were able to infiltrate about 2.3 inches of water before runoff occurred. Where you're able to see, and this also suggests that it could just be that since the manure is there, it's able to retain more water. It also can possibly suggest that the cover crop is just taking water from the soils, so these soils are slightly drier. And you're also able to see that the manure cover crop is significantly higher than the no manure no cover crop sites, and that was only able to accept about 1.5 inches of water before runoff occurred. And for the long-term manure site, although when you look at kind of the average data from all the plots, it looks like there could be differences. Statistically, there was no difference based on the treatments. So for a year, it doesn't matter what treatment you're looking at, it's going to accept approximately the same amount of water before runoff starts to occur. The last graph I'm going to be showing you is the field saturated hydraulic conductivity. So this is also kind of a metric on the infiltration rate. So this is measured in inches of water per day. And for here, the error was just so great. There was no treatment effect whatsoever. So for here, you're able to see that all the error bars kind of overlap with one another. So when it comes to the saturated hydraulic conductivity of these soils, it doesn't seem to matter whether cover crops or manure are applied. They're just not significantly different from one another. And the same thing occurred for our long-term manure study. So it didn't matter how much manure and how often it was applied. Either way, the saturated hydraulic conductivity was the same for all of the treatments. So based on all of that information, we learned that the bulk density tends to be lower in the manure cover crop and the manure no cover crop. And that's just because of the increase in the organic matter that is in the topsoil. And the bulk density tended to be higher when no manure and no cover crops were in the plots. Bulk density was also lowest when 30 tons of manure was applied on an annual basis. For runoff weight rates in infiltration, treatment didn't influence those at all in the soils down in southern Idaho. We also found that more water is able to infiltrate through the soil prior to runoff when manure and cover crop is in the field or is applied. And that could just be because the manure is able to hold more water, or possibly that the cover crops are sealing water from the cash crops. While less water is able to infiltrate through the soil prior to runoff under a no manure, no cover crop system. And lastly, we found that treatment didn't influence the field saturated hydraulic conductivity. So that goes kind of along with the runoff and infiltration rates. Even though we have all of these different treatments, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're influence the soil physical properties. One last thing I would like to mention is, although we collected all this data, we also collected aggregate stability samples. We have not processed them yet, but we have high hopes that even though we didn't see a lot of differences in some of the soil physical properties that we've already analyzed, that we expect to see more treatment differences with manure and cover crops when it comes to the proportion of macro and micro aggregates and the aggregate stability, but that is something that we will be working on in winter. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead and put questions in the chat box if you have them. We have a couple of minutes.
That's actually a good question. I'm still waiting to get the yield data from the cover crop and the silage corn to figure out if we, although we didn't see any differences with the treatments themselves, they might have affected yield. So that's still something we're looking into for those years. So I myself am not doing organic matter work. Andrew is a postdoc at NRCS, also working with Rob and April. And his project is mainly looking at organic matter and how it's changing on both of these fields, as well as GraceNet, which is another long-term study that's currently under alfalfa. So eventually the two of us will work together to see if there's any correlations between organic matter and the physical properties. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Give it a minute to see if anybody else has any questions. Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. Our next speaker will be Nick Andrews, nitrogen mineralization and immobilization predictions for cover crops, increasing, no, that's it. Nitrogen mineralization and immobilization predictions for cover crops. And here, Nick.
Hello, my name is Nick Andrews. I work with OSU Extension, and I'd like to share two projects. One is the new Western Cover Crops Council, and then the other is an update on some work that I've been doing with Dan Sullivan to predict nitrogen release from cover crops. First of all, the Western Cover Crops Council just got started in 2019. The mission is to facilitate and enhance communication and collaboration that promotes the successful adoption and integration of cover cropping into Western US agricultural systems. We're developing a new website. You can find it with an online search, but it's not going to be fully developed until probably sometime in December. The Western Cover Crops Council is the last we're the last region to develop a cover crops council. The North Central region, the Northeast region, and the Southern region have had cover crops councils for a few years, and the North Central region was the first one to develop a council. So now the entire country has cover crops councils. The Western region, as you all know, is incredibly diverse. So as a board, we've decided to split the Western region into 4 regional committees so that we can better address local conditions and regional conditions. So these 4 committees are the Pacific Northwest, the Mountain Range, the Southwest, and then the Pacific Islands. You can, when you go to the website, you can see a email link right there. And if you'd like to get involved with one of the regional committees, with your regional committee, you can send an email to the chairperson of that committee and start getting involved with the Western Cover Crops Council. On the website, we're also developing an extensive list of resources, and we've got this feature where anybody can submit a resource that will be reviewed for inclusion on the website. We're also highlighting current projects, and that part of the website is definitely still under development. But if you've got current projects, be sure to let us know about those, because we'd love to feature them on this new website. The board of directors was elected in January 2020. We've got a set of bylaws that we're operating under. Right now, we have positions on the board reserved for land-grant university representatives, producers, and seed companies, NGOs, and then we also are working with liaisons from NRCS, and they're in non-voting positions to avoid any conflict of interest. The officers for the council were elected this year as well. The president is Jeremy Allen from Five Kingdoms Farm. Claire Sullivan is the vice president. I'm the secretary. And then Javier Fernandez Salvador is the treasurer. These are the members of our regional committees. You can see on the left there is the Pacific Northwest region, representing those states, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Doug Collins is the chair. And if you'd like to join the Pacific Northwest region, you can either go to that link on the website for the PNW chair or just contact Doug directly. The Mountain region is just getting started with their committee. Matt Yost has stepped up to help coordinate that, so you can contact him if you're interested in joining the Mountain region. The Southwest is probably the most advanced of all of the regions. Sarah Light is the chairperson there, and if you'd like to join that committee, you can contact her. And then the Pacific Islands is just getting underway as well. Jason Hansen at NRCS in Hawaii is helping us get that started. So if you'd like to get involved with the Western Cover Crops Council, you can join our listserv by sending an email to this email address, info@westerncovercrops.org, and we'll get you signed up, or join a regional committee. And then we're going to be hosting sub-regional meetings starting in December. We got Intermountain webinars that will be announced on our website in December and January, a series of Pacific Northwest webinars in January and February, and then other sub-regional webinars will be announced later on. So I'd like to get to the second topic, which is cover crop nitrogen. The OSU Organic Fertilizer and Cover Crop Calculator has been online since 2010. It predicts nitrogen release from cover crops, organic fertilizers, and compost. It also predicts nutrient application rates for a wide range of macro and micronutrients, depending on the materials that you're using, the amendments that you're using. And it calculates the cost of cover crop management and the cost of nutrients from cover crops, fertilizers, and compost, so that you can compare different amendments and find cost-effective programs for your farm. In 2020, this year, we updated the calculator with new cover crop mineralization models that make 4 and 10-week plant available nitrogen predictions. The new models also predict short-term nitrogen immobilization from low nitrogen cover crops. The previous iteration just focused on nitrogen release, and it didn't predict nitrogen immobilization. From an outreach point of view, we've installed those new formulas into the OSU calculator that's online, available online. In the cover crop analysis sheet, we also allow room for 8 different cover crop fields now instead of 3 fields, which was the case in the previous version. And then we've published a few new publications, extension publications. EM 9235 goes into the formulas and the research behind the nitrogen mineralization models. And then Pacific Northwest publication 636, that's actually a revision of a 2016 PNW publication that talks about the cover crop mineralization models, cover crop sampling, and other aspects. The economic and fertilizer calculations are based on information that you provide, so they're unchanged from the previous version. For predicting nitrogen from cover crops, we're relying on some sort of biomass sampling. This is one technique, is to work any size frame that you like. Here we use 2 foot by 2 foot frames as our standard, and you can work it down into the cover crop stand and then cut the above ground part of the cover crops and collect those into a bag for processing at the side of your field. In tall viney cover crops, we usually knock down the cover crop and then place the frame on top of that thatch and then cut through that. So that would be for, I think that picture is cereal rye and common vetch, where it would be very difficult to work a frame through that cover crop stand. And then we've also used sickle bar mowers on a walk behind tractor to cut cover crops from a known area. There's lots of different ways of collecting the biomass sample. When you've got that biomass sample, you basically weigh the total fresh weight on the edge of the field. You record the area that you sampled and you send it off to the lab for total nitrogen and dry matter analysis. Then you can go to the OSU Organic Fertilizer and Cover Crop Calculator, which is online, and go to the Cover Crop Analysis tab. There you can enter, in the yellow cells, you can enter the results from your field samples and from the lab samples. And then the nitrogen predictions show up in these columns to the right. So PAN after 28 days is the 4-week prediction. PAN after 70 days is the 10-week prediction. And you can see in the first row, we had a nice triticale and vetch stand that's releasing 60 to 60 pounds of plants available nitrogen after 4 weeks and 75 pounds after 10 weeks, versus a triticale, a pure triticale stand, which is immobilizing about 20 pounds of nitrogen the first month after termination, and then about 7 pounds after 10 weeks. If you don't want to use a laboratory, or the farmer that you're working with doesn't want to use a laboratory, we do have a shortcut method that's described in PNW 636. We still recommend measuring the cover crop biomass though, because that's really the biggest source of variation. We tried to develop other ways of estimating biomass, but we couldn't really come up with anything reliable. So we are still relying on taking those biomass samples. The next step is to estimate percent dry matter and percent total nitrogen from lookup tables or typical values rather than getting a lab to analyze it. So in PNW 636, we've got some guidance on how to do that. And then you can use this chart or a lookup table that we have in that publication to predict the plant's available nitrogen release. So as an example, let's say from the previous slide where we were using the calculator, that we've got a triticale and hairy vetch stand that had 20 tons of per acre of fresh weight. And then it's a mixed stand. So we're using 15% dry matter. And that gives us 3 tons of dry matter per acre. And then for a mixed vetch cereal mix, we'll say estimate that we are about 3% total nitrogen for that stand. So you look up on this table, 3% total nitrogen, 3% total nitrogen at 28 days or 4 weeks gives you 20 pounds of pan per ton, or 25 pounds of pan per ton at 10 weeks. So you multiply those values by 3, which was the 3 tons of dry matter. So the total plant available nitrogen release per acre is 60 pounds of pan at 1 month and 75 pounds of pan after 10 weeks. If you've got a triticale stand, you go through the same process, and just for expedience, let's say that it was the same fresh weight, 20 tons per acre fresh weight, 15% dry matter, gives us again 3 tons of dry matter per acre, but this time it was a 1% total nitrogen cover crop. So if you take -6 pounds of pan per ton of dry matter times 3, that'll give you -18 pounds of pan, or 18 pounds of nitrogen being immobilized after 4 weeks. And then about -2 times 3 tons per acre is -6 pounds of pan after 10 weeks. In the few minutes remaining, I wanted to talk about one of the ways that we're using this kind of information and this tool in a Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District funded project. We just got started last year. The title is Cover Crops and Nutrient Management in Vegetables. In 2019 and 2020, we worked with 5 farmers. This year, we're increasing the farmer collaborators to 7. And then in the final year, we'll be up to 9 farm collaborators. On all of these farms, we're doing routine soil analysis and providing general nutrient management advice. And we're also using soil nitrate tests and making nitrogen recommendations using this new extension publication, EM 9221. Dan Sullivan, again, is the lead author on that. The title is Soil Nitrate Testing for Willamette Valley Vegetable Production. I'm not going to talk much about that because I want to focus on the cover crop trials, that component of the project. We're doing collaborative on-farm cover crop trials, and we're doing 2 experiments, and these were directed by the interests of the collaborating farmers in year 1, and we're going to try to continue these experiments for all 3 years of the project. One of the objectives that the growers were interested in was getting the most nitrogen from their cover crops. So we're comparing common vetch to a couple of hairy vetch varieties and a couple of crimson clover varieties with 1 replicate per farm per year. And then the other one was with triticale stand, and then what's the minimum amount of vetch that you could add to that stand so that you avoid nitrogen immobilization. Here you can see from our first year results that the zero immobilization trial with triticale did produce a little bit more biomass than the pure legume stands. We got about 1.23 to 3.1 tons of dry matter per acre from the legumes and 3.3 to 4 tons of dry matter per acre from the triticale and vetch stands. That's just with unreplicated trials on 3 farms. So we're going to be continuing that to get a little bit more robust information. Here you can see that common vetch did very well. The AU Merit hairy vetch did very well as well. And then the woolly pod vetch and organic Dixie crimson clover also performed quite well. AU Sunrise didn't perform as well as the others. With the zero immobilization trial, these results were interesting. We had 100 pounds of triticale with 0 vetch, 12 pounds per acre of vetch, 24 pounds per acre of vetch, and 36 pounds per acre of vetch. You can see that with the 0 and 12 pounds per acre of vetch, we were immobilizing. This is the 0 line where we're not immobilizing nitrogen. If you're above that line, we're mineralizing. If you're below that line, we're immobilizing. So those 2 mixtures were immobilizing for the most part. And then this mixture was immobilizing in the short run and then and mineralizing nitrogen later on in the season after, up to about 10 weeks. But the 36 pounds of vetch was releasing nitrogen from the outset. So we are going to continue those trials, and we're going to share this data online as part of a Western SARE Research to Grassroots grant that Doug Collins is the PI on. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah, thank you.
If you have questions for Nick, please put them in the chat box.
I apologize for the phone call and my dog's barking in the background during the recording.
So I have on the pan levels that you reported were based off your modeling through the extension publication work.
Yeah, we didn't do buried bag studies, or what we developed the models using mainly lab incubations of cover crops, but now we're just using, that was a bit more involved process and more expensive. So now we're just using the models that are in the calculator.
There's a couple questions in the chat box.
Yeah, so our work is, question is soil water depletion due to cover crops versus nitrogen, which is important in your location. We're in the Willamette Valley west of the Cascades, and mostly in irrigated systems. So the focus of our work has been on nitrogen release. But water moisture dynamics are important. We just haven't done any work on that yet, really. I've heard from a couple of growers that just recently adopted cover crops that they've noticed they've been able to delay the time, delay their first irrigation in the spring with crops like silage corn or sweet corn. And then that's really helped them reduce weed pressure in those fields because they didn't have to irrigate until the corn was almost at canopy closure. So that was kind of an interesting observation, but definitely different context than high desert or unirrigated systems.
There was one more there. Do you expect the results in the zero immobilization trial to be similar with other legumes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not necessarily, because the nitrogen content of legumes can vary a little bit. In that on-farm trial, we decided to go with triticale and common vetch because those are really popular cover crops in our area. And we're not really hoping to get a precise number. We think that about 25% legume biomass in the final cover crop is enough to avoid immobilization. And we're just looking for a bit of information on kind of rule of thumb, how does that translate to seeding rates? So, the size of the seed is obviously going to play a big role too. So if you're using clovers rather than vetches, it would, be totally different seeding rates.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nick.
Yeah, thank you.
And just some housekeeping here. We have 2 more presentations, which will take us to about 1:10. And then at that point, there will be a poll, which we really would like you to hang out and take to get some feedback on this conference as a whole, or the session in particular. And then we also have an attendee sign-up sheet that we can do for CEU credits. So our next speaker is Rujan Kin, increasing cover crop diversity for post-harvest season in the Columbia Basin of Oregon.
Hello, here's Ray from Hermitage Station for OSU. Today I will just share my study about cover crop diversity and the take-home message, and based on first-year data, and we found for 3 brassica family crop and 1 cool-season crop, ryegrass, maybe the promising cover crop for the Columbia Basin. So Columbia Basin is an important agricultural region for irrigating the crop. Growers use a lot of fertilizer, pesticide, water in order to achieve the best crop yield. However, they are facing stringent regulation because the irrigated land is considered one of the major contributors to groundwater nitrate leaching contamination. And actually, growers monitor the fertilizer irrigation very carefully during the cropping season, but the nitrate level still remain or even increase, so which may highly related with degradation of soil health. And also growers have a lot of concern about soil health and agriculture sustainability. In the region, growers have already noticed the importance of cover crop in field management. However, in general, the cover crop information is quite limited. And so far, the cover crop options also very limited. And in many cases, the grower repeat the same crop as wheat, for example. And because wheat can be the rotational crop and often grow after potato, before potato. And so then when they grow the wheat again as a cover crop, so that means repeat the same crop. So it's not a sustainable solution for the soil resource conservation and crop production sustainability. Also, it may improve the disease and insect pressure because the life cycle is not broken. To solve the problem, and selecting more cover crops is needed, especially for the crops they grow fast and tolerate cold, and they can update more residual nitrate should be the ideal cover crops. So the objective for the study is select the best performing cover crop during post-harvest season, evaluate the cover crop impact on the soil health and quality, provide information to growers. And we started the study last year from August 15 to this year, March 16. The first study mainly focused on selecting the ideal variety. So the study included 5 cool season grass. This is the list. 5 warm season grass. This is the list. And 5 legume. This is the list. And 5 brassica. This is the list. During the growth, we've had a serious issue for parsley, and so we spray chemicals to Carto also use a manual weed for brassica. So these two chemical for the bee plant, this for grass plant. This happens 3 weeks after planting. The experimental design is a randomized complete block design with 4 reps. So in total there are 80 plus, and the individual plant has a size 6 feet wide and 50 feet long, holding 7 rows of plants. This is basic information for cover crop seeding. So this is for cool season grass, warm season grass, and this is legume, and this is brassica. The unit is a part per acre. This information about the temperature, so we can see here 32 line across. So whenever the temperature lower than this, that means there's a frost issue. So the early frost actually happened in early October, then with the season. So, and the weather getting colder and colder. And about the precipitation, so September has total precipitation up to 1.8 inches. Then for the rest of the month, in general, October, November is quite dry, and then December to March is a little bit wet. And to promote the crop growth, we also apply water. So the water, this value is based on the weekly, and the data point is the end of each week. So from beginning is 1.5 to the levels 0.3 from mid-August to the end of October. So this is the irrigation. So for the separate field observation, we observe the plant height biomass and happen on October 8 to 9 before first frost. Plant growth was observed throughout the trial, and the survived plant through the winter was unidentified. The result about the cover crop germination, generally the germination look okay for all the crop. This is cool season. As warm season, this is like the brassica, and this is a legume. But this is an example for the wheat press a lot personally. This is 5 weeks after sowing. So example for the cool season crop, in general, they are quite similar for wheat, barley, triticale, and oat. So I just put one picture here. This is a ryegrass. The plant much shorter than the other cool season crop. This is warm season crop. 3 good performing crops. So this is approximately millet, pearl millet, and the sorghum Sudan. This is brassica, turnip, radish, kale, and brassica. So the rest one, like a rape, is in general the plant is very limited. I mean, in many cases you cannot see the plant. This is about legume, veg, pea, cowpea, and clover. Either plant is too short, and also we have the serious weeds issue. So around 7 weeks after planting, we did the field measurement. At that time, the growing stage for the cool season crop, except ryegrass, all up to the blooming or the heady stage. For the warm season, one has up to heady stage, the rest is vegetative. So the legume and either vegetative or flower stage, but in general, plant is short or not so many plant, and brassica or the vegetative stage. This is about plant height. Overall, the cool season grass, this 3 has the highest plant height, and the legume plant, they relatively shorter, and also the canopies they can cover much small area. About the plant coverage, and for the brassica family except rape, the rest has a good coverage. And the blue color means the crop coverage. Brown color means the weight percentage. And for the cool season crop, we generally have a good coverage, and the weight is very limited. For the warm season crop, we can see the proso millet, and also we have the Sudan, sorghum Sudan, and per millet, they have a good coverage. And the rest crops not so competitive. The legume crop in general has a poor coverage because of poor competition. This is plotted biomass. The higher biomass, larger than 1 ton per acre, was sold for the crop for the brassica, turnip, kale, and forage brassica. For the cool season crop, like all the wheat, barley, triticale, and oat, also the good biomass. And for the warm season, the millet per millet, sorghum Sudan has good biomass, and the legume crop in general has a low biomass. So this is how the crop look like after 3 months. So actually for the brassica family, the radish suffer the cold stress. Of course, all the crops suffer, but this is more serious and killed this time. And for the cool season, except brassica, so all the rest crops suffered the cold stress and died. This is about the warm season. So actually they died right after the initial frost. For the legume crop, in general, they are quite small. And also pea, this is a veg, they already suffer the stress. This is clover, tennis plant. So this is an observation in March of this year. So in general, turnip, kale, and forage brassica still show the good growth. And for the cool season crop, only ryegrass survived. Legume crop, we have clover survived, but the plant's so tiny. So this is what we have based on what we have. And summary, there's a possibility to increase cover crop diversity during post-harvest season. First year data suggests 3 brassica and 1 cool season crop, ryegrass, may be promising cover crop for the region. We need more data in order to make the conclusion. Further research needed include continued cover crop selection, evaluate the cover crop impact on soil health, and also evaluate the potential impact on the main crop after cover crop. For example, this is how the root look like. We saw, especially for the brassica, inside the root there's some insect survived, and also the root is a rod, so maybe related with some pathogen. So we need to do something to understand the impact for the following crop. So acknowledge to the farm crew for the field management and the student technician for the field management, measurement, and harvest. By that, I would stop and take any question if you have. So here's my email. If you do not have a question now, you can ask me later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray.
Thank you.
Have some questions if you have them.
So Doug, should I read the question or you read for me?
If you could read it, that would be great.
Okay, so first question is, could you review again when the crops were planted? Was the warm season crop planted in fall? The planting date is mid-August. The main reason why grow the warm season crop actually, originally we say we should have 2 targets. One is increase the cover crop, and another is check if possible to use the residual time, still not that cold, to produce more biomass. It's why to use warm season crop, check if possible to grow a lot of biomass.
I guess the follow-up question is, do you think you'd find, would it be better to sort of optimize planting time based on the different warm season versus cool season?
I think, yeah, planting time should be very important. For example, this year we plant all the crop 2 weeks later, so the warm season crop, the performance is much worse. And yeah, the cool season look still quite consistently good. And also the brassica look very good. And the legume crop not so good.
Give it a second, see if anybody else has any questions.
Any question? Otherwise, maybe I leave my email address, also telephone number, so in case people have questions, they can send me email. How about that?
Yeah, that's great. You can put it in the chat if you'd like.
Okay.
And here we have one more question for you, Ray, if you're still there.
Yes. Are the growers you work with interested in cover crop at all to get early establishment? You mean at all? To be honest, I didn't catch your point. Can you explain more, Andy?
Nick, you want to, or
yeah, are they?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Nick. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Are they interseeding the cover crop when the cash crop is still in place, or even eating a cover crop when they seed the cash crop?
Very good question. Very good question. Yeah. So far, what I see, so they just the time is really important. Once they finish harvesting, they quickly go to grow cover crop, but not every farmer grow cover crop. So because we have the major crop is potato, so in my understanding, it should be quite difficult to grow the interseed cover crop because the whole field will be disturbed. Yeah.
To harvest, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I will go ahead and leave my email address so we can communicate later. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Great job. I'd like to hear how that goes in the future. Okay, everybody, the last presentation is by me, Doug Collins, promoting cover crop success with compost and fertilizer. Hello, I'm Doug Collins. I'm an extension specialist and soil scientist with WSU. I'm at the Puyallup Research and Extension Center, and I'm going to share some research today about promoting cover crop success with compost and fertilizer. This research was conducted on farm at 4 Elements Farm in Puyallup, Washington. And one of the things that 4 Elements is concerned with is improving their soil quality. One of the comments I've heard from them is we can't even grow cover crops on our land. This is land that was in commercial squash and corn production for many, many years. And they run an organic farm. And so are interested in improved soil fertility and quality, have attempted to use cover crops in that, and found that even cover crops don't grow so well in parts of their farm. So we conducted a 2-year experiment at 4 Elements, and a couple of things that we took into our trial were, one, we used named cover crop varieties. This is important, I think, going forward in terms of using cover crops as a tool to improve soil fertility and soil quality. We make sure that way we have more of a chance of success from year to year or from seeing consistent results. We used with and without compost treatments, and then with and without organic fertilizer. And then we also targeted the planting rates on a seeds per square foot basis. We seeded in September, mid to late September, both 2018 and 2019. And for grains, we had targeted seeds per square foot of 42. And then, or this is more like live plants per square foot is what we're targeting. Vetches 7, Berseem clover 57, and Balansa clover 26. And you can see these are the plants that we used in the trial. So 3 vetches, 3 grains, and 2 clovers. And what that converted to in terms of pounds per acre, which many of us are more familiar with, was around 79 pounds per acre. And these are target live seeds of the Aroostook rye, 94 of the Rinzabruzzi rye, 152 of oats, Purple Bounty, 18 pounds per acre, common vetch, 40 pounds per acre, and the woolly pod vetch, 25 pounds per acre, and then the clovers at 12 and 3 pounds for the Berseem and Balansa clovers. This was a split plot design with 4 replications. So the main plots, or the largest plots, were where compost was applied. So that would be this brown area. And then the first split was variety. So you can see one subplot, in this case, frosty clover, the whole subplot's receiving that. And then half of each subplot fertilizer was applied. And this just shows, again, the information about the target seeds per foot, what that meant in terms of target pounds per acre, and then our actual seeded pounds per acre in 2018 and 2019. So we did a decent job of trying to hit those targets. And we're fairly consistent from year to year. Some of the timeline for amendment for the field operations. Again, we soil sampled before application of compost, so early September. Compost was applied mid-September. In 2018, this was a rate of 2.6 dry tons per acre, and in 2019, 7.1 dry tons per acre. And then soil was tilled immediately after that. Fertilizer was made on the same day of planting, fertilizer application, so 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre with the feather meal 1100, and then cover crops were seeded. We did both years a post-application sampling in just one of the cover crops, one of the clovers actually, just to see how that fertilizer application and that compost application made weeks before affected the germinating and growing cover crop. You can see that in 2018, there was very low available nitrogen in these plots. So 3 parts per million nitrate, 2.1 parts per million ammonium before application of the fertilizer and compost. What these data show is that in the fall following that compost and fertilizer application, there was more ammonium available with the compost and than without compost. So this is the ammonium. So compost had an increase on ammonium application. Oh, I'm sorry, this is with the fertilizer. So fertilizer increased the ammonium concentration in the soil following application, and then compost increased the soil nitrate following application. 4 weeks post-application. So we did see a bump in available nitrogen with both compost or fertilizer, with the compost that came more as a nitrate bump, whereas with that chicken meal fertilizer, it came more as an ammonium bump. And so this shows a plot of oats taken a few weeks after seeding in the fall winter of the first year of the trial. And so this is a plot that received compost, and here you can see the fertilizer effect with fertilizer in the top picture and without fertilizer in the bottom picture. And these are some of the other characters in the trial. In the middle, as you'll see later, Lana Woolly Pod Vetch was probably the winner among the vetches, and we'll have lots of data to show that. You can see the common vetch that we use, Languedoc, which has a great name, but did not fare as well in this trial. And then the Purple Bounty Vetch did a little bit better than this picture would suggest. So these are taken sort of midwinter in the first year of the trial. And then the 2 clovers, as we'll see, neither did very well. in either year of the trial. So we were very careful to try to do operations, especially around incorporation, in line with the phenological stage of the cover crop. So these data show the phenological stages for the grass cover crops in 2019 and 2020. So in the spring of 2019, following the fall 2018 seeding, and 2020, same thing with the fall 2019 seeding. And we use the Zadok scale here. So what is kind of important here is around that 40 on the Zadok scale. That's when we reach boot stage. And then following boot, we get head emergence and then anthesis at the 60. So general rules here, if you are going to incorporate a grass species, it's good to do that incorporation at around boot stage. Don't want to wait too much, actually, yeah, around elongation. So early, around the 40s, maybe late 30s, is a good time to incorporate to avoid nitrogen immobilization. So we were a bit later than that in 2019 and a little closer to that target for the rise in 2020. And oats, same thing. The other thing to notice is the big difference here between the rate of phenological progression between the rye and the oats. So the rye are ready to be incorporated much sooner than the oats would be, or you have more time potentially with the oats. And this kind of shows that point here. So the picture on the left shows oats and rye, April 25th, 2019. So this was about the date that the rye was terminated for our study. And you can see the oats are still, you know, in that early elongation stage, or not there yet even. And then this is what the oats look like on the termination date. So starting to get some heading oats when we did terminate them. These data show the, bar is in my way. These data show the above ground biomass for the grasses with compost, without compost, and with fertilizer and without fertilizer. And there was a very strong fertilizer effect and a strong variety effect. So you can see, you know, oats outperforming the rye, especially with compost in 2019. But overall, pretty much better than rye in terms of overall above ground biomass. And then the fertilizer effect is very strong across the grasses. So we had a highly significant fertilizer effect. And we saw an average 46% yield increase with fertilizer with the grasses. Compost effect was 0.26 p-value in 2019 and 0.13 in 2020, so not a very strong compost effect. This is, again, looking at phenological progression. This is Vetch this time. And the scale is different. This is a Mishler scale that we use. And it is 1 means 100% vegetative, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are sort of a progression in terms of how much of the plant or field is flowering. So a 2 is a 20% flowering on up to a 6, which would be 100% flowering. And so our target for termination would be during the flowering stage, maybe late flowering. We certainly want to terminate before we get any pod development. And again, here you can see the difference in species and their termination. So the common vetch, or the Languedoc is the one we used, reaching flowering, late flowering, pod development, you know, mid-April in 2019, whereas the Lana vetch was more like early May, and Purple Bounty was still had a ways to go. So Purple Bounty is a hairy vetch, still had a much later development than the Lana, or especially the Languedoc. And I think I saw these pictures already, so you can see the Lana doing well. Languedoc looked pretty good in 2019. And then this just shows the timing of flowering and also the types of flowering. So early flowering in the Languedoc, sort of, you can see some flowering in the purple bounty, but it was much lower. You can see when we look at all the data. And then on May 15th, and then May 15th with the Lana vetch full flower starting to go towards pod development. So this is the above ground biomass with the vetches, and they were harvested on the different dates due to the phenology. And there was no strong compost or fertilizer effect. A slight increase in compost yield with compost, slight increase in vetch yield with compost, but not significant. The clovers, I'm not showing a lot of data on. I'll show one sort of overall biomass graph here in a second, but they just didn't perform very well in terms of biomass production. We did have a couple of plots, and I think this is one of my take-home messages, that the legumes, there would be like the occasional plot that did really well. So grasses, on the other hand, would be very consistent from plot to plot across the field. Legumes, I'd say especially the clovers, were more inconsistent across the field. So that might have to do with weed pressure, which can vary considerably. But interestingly, those grasses would be consistent across the plots in the trial, even with that varying weed pressure. So this shows the overall above ground biomass with all of the species trialed. And so you can see the oats doing really well, rye next, and then Lana vetch kind of up there almost with the rye in terms of above ground biomass production, and the clovers not really producing much biomass at all by the time termination happened. So here, this is asking the question, did compost and fertilizer affect the concentration of nitrogen in the grasses? And the answer was no. So even with, we see a big biomass effect, but not seeing a difference really in the concentration of nitrogen in the grasses. Same question with the vetches. Did the concentration of nitrogen, was that affected by compost or fertilizer? Again, here the answer was no in terms of concentration. But what about the content? So here we would take the concentration times the biomass, and was there effect from compost or fertilizer on the content of nitrogen? So if you look at that whole cover crop, there's a bunch of nitrogen in there. How much is in there? That's what we're asking with this, with these data here. And so of course there was a huge increase in the biomass with grasses with fertilizer. So we see a corresponding increase in the nitrogen content with fertilizer. So same concentration, but more of the nitrogen. I'm sorry, more biomass. And with vetches, not a strong relationship. It wasn't significant, fertilizer or compost, on the content, but there was a compost by variety effect in 2020. So you can see, for example, with Lana vetch, looking like more biomass with just that variety with the compost. So we see this interaction. Overall, a 32% increase in the nitrogen content with compost among vetches, but not a significant effect. And then this shows the nitrogen content across all the species tested. And this is, this shows us quite a bit, obviously. So vetches are really going to be valuable in terms of adding that nitrogen content to the cropping system, something we can count on to utilize for the following crop. It is also, there's quite a big difference in the species. So Lana vetch doing much better than purple bounty vetch or the Languedoc vetch. And then this is asking the question of, okay, after we incorporated the cover crop, what is the nitrogen availability a few weeks after incorporation? And was there an effect with fertilizer or compost on that? The answer was no, there was not. The fertilizer, this is only 1 year, so this is just 2019, following incorporation in 2019. And no compost or fertilizer effect with the grasses on that nitrogen availability. And with vetch, there was surprisingly almost a fertilizer effect, so 0.08 p-value for vetch availability following fertilizer, which is very interesting because we didn't see a big effect on biomass or nitrogen content with fertilizer. And then this is showing all the cover crop species and the nitrogen availability. So here we see the potential to immobilize nitrogen with grasses despite fertilizer or cover crop effect. These are all, these are with the, all these plots where it had compost and fertilizer, and you can see that that nitrogen availability after incorporation of the cover crop is really most affected or most increased by vetch, especially Lana vetch, which performed well both years. So in conclusion, we saw strong nitrogen fertilizer effect on all grass species, biomass and nitrogen contribution, but no fertilizer effect on legume biomass, but a variety by fertilizer interaction on legume nitrogen content. Soil had lower nitrogen content than vetches following incorporation. Biomass was larger with composting grasses and legumes, but not significantly. There was greater variability across plots with legumes, perhaps because of lower competitiveness against weeds. And I would also emphasize that variety was critical to success, especially with vetch. Thank you very much. Okay, we have time for some questions. If anybody has any questions for me. I'm gonna have to ask myself a question if nobody has any. Did I use herbicides? No, this is an on-farm study at an organic farm. And so they don't use, conventional herbicides, or I don't think they use very many organic herbicides either. So, but yeah, that was data that I didn't really get a chance to completely analyze, was looking at the coverage. And I mentioned some anecdotally how competitive the grasses were relative to the legumes, but weeds are definitely a big problem at a lot of organic farms and definitely at this farm. So it makes it a challenge to get, especially the clovers established, but also the vetches, and that's where I think the variety makes a difference. So having a good competitive vetch, it was able to establish. But yeah, weeds are a problem. We didn't do any herbicide application or cultivation of the cover crop. How were the cover crops terminated? These were pretty small plots, 6 feet by, well, 5 foot of planted area by 15 feet. We had a walk behind sickle mower that we mowed them down with, and then I actually used a BCS walk behind tiller to incorporate them, and then waited about 3 weeks and did the soil test. And then Nick asks, very interesting work on depleted soil. Are results consistent with what you see on healthier soils in the area? Yeah, that's a great question. Very low nitrogen availability before we applied fertilizer or compost to this area. We actually did the same. We didn't do the compost component, but at our research farm, we did the same varieties with the fertilizer component, and really did not see that fertilizer effect even in the grasses. So, more, I guess, the soil was different. I can't really say for sure what is different about it, but it's been farmed organically longer, maybe higher organic matter, but we didn't see that fertilizer effect. So it's not necessarily something you would see in every soil, but the farmers saying particularly that they have trouble growing cover crops. I think it just kind of gets to the point that, the cover crops are plants too, they're a crop. They need to be kind of tended to, and in order for them to succeed. Wim asks, have to wonder if manure as a nutrient source would enliven the soil. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting questions. I didn't have the carbon nitrogen content of the compost applied. I think it's probably around 21 C to N ratio, so not very high potent stuff. So yeah, manure with a little more nitrogen available. I think that harkens back to some of the earlier talks we saw here about, application of manure, and it's a question we get here a lot as well. But I think there's potential for that fall application of manure followed by a cover crop planting, especially if it could be done in September, not in October, for example. So yeah, I didn't see with the compost, we didn't see nitrate levels. For example, we made the compost, or even with the fertilizer application, we didn't see nitrate levels a couple of weeks later that would be alarming. So I think that's good news, even where there wasn't a cover crop. So I think it's just going to depend on that soil. If the soil is kind of in that depleted area, not generating a lot of nitrogen or not a lot of excess nitrogen there, we may have room to apply some fertilizer or manure. And then somebody says, I'm sorry I missed it, but what was the soil type? This is a fine sandy loam. Yeah. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. So before you go, let me launch a poll here. So everybody, please take a minute to fill out this poll. And this is relative to the whole session. I'll provide the CEU information here in a second. I'm going to stop recording. I just want to thank everybody for coming this morning, and especially thank all of our presenters. Very great work going on, and I definitely plan to follow up with some of you and learn more.